My name is Laura, and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to my husband, Nick, for 3 years. We're both the same age. We both work full-time, so we share the housework and manage to balance things pretty well. We don't have any kids yet, but we enjoy our life together. I work as a sales representative for a big company. It's a tough job, but I get paid well. Nick earns a bit less than I do. Even though Nick doesn't make as much money, I respect him because he loves his work and takes pride in it. Nick likes fishing as a hobby, so he's often away, but I understand he needs it to relax and take a break from work. We keep our savings separate, and I pay for all of our living expenses except for rent, which we split equally. I don't have any hobbies like Nick, but I enjoy seeing him happy with his. I'm fine with him spending money on his hobbies, while I focus on saving for our daily needs. The only thing that bothers me is Nick's mom, Wendy. We live very close to his parents, and since Wendy has trouble walking, Nick visits her often. That's fine with me, and I go with him when we don't have other plans. Today was our day off, so Nick asked me to go to his parents' house and bring a gift. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Wendy said, putting her hand on her cheek and sighing deeply. She said it had been a while, but we had just seen them last week. I thought to myself, she's probably saying that because Nick visited her alone last week, since I had to work on my day off for something urgent. I know you're busy, but before being an employee, you're my son's wife, right? Wendy said. I replied, yes. Wendy always talks to me like this. She doesn't like that I work so hard and earn more than Nick. She says things like, a woman should support her husband, it's wrong for a woman to work so hard, and that Nick feels embarrassed by how much I work. Oh, Mom, stop it. Laura and I already talked about this, Nick said, stepping in. Well, if you say so, then nothing can be done, Wendy replied. Nick usually has to stop his mom from criticizing me. I think Wendy, who has always been a stay-at-home mom, doesn't understand my feelings and will never agree with me working so hard. I'm really sorry, Nick always says on the way home. It's very stressful to be criticized by Wendy, but I try to deal with it because Nick always stands up for me and feels bad about it. When I checked the bank book after work, I noticed that this month's rent wasn't paid. That means I couldn't withdraw the money to pay for it. I asked Nick if he had forgotten to put the money into the account, since he usually does it after he gets paid. I don't have enough money this month again, he said. This had happened before. He probably bought something expensive and ran out of money, so he couldn't pay even half of the rent. When I sighed, Nick just laughed and tried to brush it off. Sorry, can you pay it this time? He said, as if it wasn't a big deal. I could understand if it only happened once or twice. I know sometimes he wants to buy something expensive, but this happened last month too. Well, a limited edition fishing rod just came out, he said. You said the same thing last month, though, I replied. If you really wanted it, why didn't you at least talk to me first? Even though we keep our accounts separate, if he can't even pay his share of the rent, that's a problem. Nick is supposed to pay half of the rent, but if he can't, I have to cover the whole thing, plus all the living expenses. I can't do that on my own. Ugh, stop nagging me, he interrupted as I tried to explain, sighing like it was no big deal. Nagging? I said, surprised. I get that this happens sometimes, but we agreed to pay the rent together. I was starting to worry about how he spent his money, but I hadn't said anything before. If anything comes up, you just talk about money, aren't you too obsessed with it, Laura? Nick said. I was shocked. How can you say that? We can't stay here if we don't pay the rent, right? Talking about money all the time is disgraceful, he replied. What, disgraceful? That's what Nick said to me. Why would he say that? I knew Nick didn't care much about money, and that was one of the things I liked about him, so even though he didn't save a lot, I thought it was okay if I saved the money and took care of the family finances. But to him, that was disgraceful. When I didn't say anything, Nick probably thought I couldn't argue back, so he sighed and said, I knew you were like this, but like my mom says, women should stay at home and support their husbands. What? If you don't support me as your husband, you'll be the one embarrassed later, he added, looking at his phone. I didn't know what to say. Nick always apologized and said his mom's views were old-fashioned and that she didn't understand me, but in the end, it all came back to her idea. What does Nick mean by supporting him as my husband? Does it mean I should silently manage the family finances? I came home late one day from work. Welcome home, Nick greeted me. Wait, what? Wendy's here? I didn't know she was coming over, I said, surprised. She took my bag and walked into the living room. I was shocked when I saw it. What's going on? The living room was full of cardboard boxes and packages that weren't there this morning. It was so crowded I could barely move. Not only was my mother-in-law there, but my father-in-law too. Nick was just sitting there, watching TV and drinking beer, laughing. Hey, what's happening? I asked. Don't talk so loud, Nick frowned. My mom and dad moved in today, he said. They moved in with us? I didn't hear anything about them moving in. You didn't mention anything this morning, I said, confused. My mother-in-law was unpacking her things with no care, smiling like everything was fine. Hey, I didn't hear about this, I said again. Mom can't walk very well anymore. She can still walk a little, but it's hard for her to live on her own, Nick explained. But we have an extra room, so it's fine, he added. I thought it would be better for you to live with Mom, so it won't be a burden on you. I'll help with the housework, and it'll be easier for you since you're always busy with work. It felt like they didn't care about me at all anymore. I told Nick I didn't want to live with his parents, but he didn't seem to listen. Seeing him act like this made me want to cry. We had gone through the trouble of renting a bigger house because we wanted space for a baby in the future, but I never imagined our family would grow like this. Living with Nick's parents felt terrible. They took over the room I had planned for a future baby, and it felt like they owned the house. My favorite sofa and dining table were no longer available to me. They told me that as the wife, I was supposed to do all the chores and not even sit down. The only time I could sit was when everyone was asleep, and I was alone. Eating leftovers by myself every day made me want to cry. What am I doing? How did this happen? My in-laws never paid for anything. When I asked them for help with money, they said, "You make a lot of money, but you're too stingy. Are you trying to take our pension money?" And they would yell at me. When I talked to Nick about it, he just looked disappointed. It's fine, it's just money. Mom is doing the housework, so they're helping you, right? He said. But in the end, Wendy would complain about how her feet and legs hurt from cleaning, cooking, and washing dishes, so I ended up doing it all. She did the laundry, but I didn't want to mix my clothes with theirs. In the end, I did all the laundry by myself. Since Nick's parents moved in, there were more people in the house, which meant more chores and more financial stress. I complained about it, but no one listened. Instead, they yelled at me, saying they didn't think I was such a cold person. What the heck? If you have a problem, leave. Nick, who used to support me, wasn't the husband I loved anymore. I realized I couldn't be happy living with these people anymore. Day after day, I was blamed for everything. Meals were wasted, and my personal belongings would disappear or end up in the trash. I became numb to it all. Then, there was the issue with the living expenses. You're still talking about that? You make a lot of money, so just handle it, they'd say. But my credit card was being used without my permission. Was this Wendy's doing? I only borrowed a little. I'll pay you back later. Wendy snickered when I showed her the credit card statement. I was shocked to see nearly $5,000 spent in 1 month. Wendy admitted she used my credit card, and I found many branded items in her room that she clearly bought using it. Nick knew about this, but didn't say anything. He stopped helping with the chores we used to share, and now he didn't even want to look at me. But I wasn't going to let this go on forever. That was enough. The next day, after I spoke to my lawyer, I took a paid leave from work. I left the house, but returned with movers and their truck. What about work? Wendy, who was alone at home when I returned, asked, confused. She saw the movers behind me and looked puzzled. Excuse me, we might be a bit noisy, I said, ignoring her. I told the movers to start. Huh? Who are these people? Wendy asked. Well, please get started, I told the movers. Walking past Wendy, who was shocked at what was happening, I led them to my room. Please take everything out, I said. They quickly packed up my things and started carrying them out. I felt relieved as I watched them. I wished I had left earlier. This hell could have ended sooner. Hey, what are you doing? I won't let you get away with this, Wendy yelled, but I ignored her. She started calling someone, probably Nick or my father-in-law. I didn't care who she called. I knew it would all be over before they arrived. Wendy kept complaining, but she couldn't stop the movers. Oh, sorry, this is the last one, I said, after most of my things were moved out. I turned to Wendy, who was still complaining. I'm leaving. Huh? Can you give this to Nick for me? I asked, holding out an envelope. Just then, the front door opened. Nick had rushed back in. As I expected, Nick returned after the movers finished their work. They had packed everything up in just half an hour. What the hell? Nick said, staring at the empty room, then glaring at me. Nick rushed in, looking angry. What the hell do you think you're doing? I smiled and handed him the envelope, ignoring his angry expression. He was shocked when he saw what was inside. Divorce papers. What? Nick said, surprised. Wendy came running over to see what was in Nick's hand. What are you doing? How dare you give my son divorce papers? It's time for a divorce, let's end this, I said calmly. You need to be grateful to Nick for marrying you, and it's your job to serve him and his family. The movers, who had been quietly waiting, looked surprised at Wendy's rude comments. I realized then that her behavior was out of line. I'm not wrong, this isn't normal. You told me to leave if I had a problem, didn't you? I said to Nick, who was stunned. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he stammered, probably shocked that I had the courage to do it. Well, I've had enough, and now I'm leaving, I said, turning and walking out with the movers. I apologized to the movers for the commotion, but they were supportive. They said they knew what had been going on and comforted me. I felt a mix of fear, sadness, and relief, but I was proud of myself for leaving. Afterwards, I officially filed for divorce through my lawyer. I had been preparing for this moment. I consulted a lawyer and gathered evidence of all the reasons I wanted a divorce, including all the complaints and criticisms from Wendy and Nick, as well as the personal belongings they had thrown away. My lawyer said I had enough evidence, so we moved forward. I had already signed a lease for my new place, and all that was left was to move my things. I smiled at the thought of starting fresh, even though I had to leave behind some of my favorite furniture. It felt exciting to finally live on my own terms. Nick and Wendy were not happy about the divorce. Nick even stormed into my lawyer's office asking for my whereabouts. He also tried waiting for me at work, but with the help of my colleagues, I was able to avoid them. The things Nick and his parents had done were terrible, and my lawyer said that if it went to court, we would definitely win. Nick didn't want a trial, because it would cost him more money, so he reluctantly agreed to the divorce. I also demanded that Wendy pay me back for using my credit card without permission, along with alimony. Wendy fought back at first, but when I threatened to report her to the police, she backed down. Wendy kept saying, "We're family," but I realized she only meant her own little family, her, Nick, and her husband. She had forgotten about me. I felt disgusted every time she used the word family to try and manipulate me. After the divorce was final, Nick and his parents moved away. The neighborhood didn't want them around after all the drama, and Nick couldn't afford the rent without me. They moved to a small house in a rural area, and Nick now had to live on his small salary and his parents' pension. Nick tried to contact me many times, texting, "We're struggling, please come home," but I blocked his messages. As for me, I'm finally happy. I live in a place filled with things I love and work at a job I enjoy. I don't have to worry about people invading my privacy or always complaining about me. Life is much more comfortable now. There's a colleague at work who I'm interested in. We're both busy, but he's kind and understands that I need time to trust him. He's patient and says he'll wait. We support each other and are independent, and I'm excited to see where this relationship can go. I'm ready to live a happy life with someone who respects me.
Inga walked to work trying to cope with rising anxiety. She was angry with herself. Really, should she, a former boarding school girl, be afraid of sidelong glances, ill wishes and gossips? She'd seen worse. But the chill wouldn't go away. The suspended sentence had broken her, stripped away her self-confidence and will to fight back. It didn't matter that it was suspended, that someone had forged her signature on fictitious documents. She, Inga, was convicted. And just like that, her whole life turned upside down. At least she'd found work as an office cleaner. No one would even consider her for an interview once they saw her criminal record. Jacob Eriksson, bless his kind soul, had taken pity and hired her. However, the entire office doesn't say hello, checks their bags and hides their belongings. What kind of people were they? Don't they know one cannot be totally safe from poverty in prison. Life can take a very sharp turn. 6 months ago she couldn't have imagined this fate. She had had everything: a husband, a home, a son, a career she loved, and a good friend. Or rather, someone she thought was a good friend. When had Rita's envy grown so consuming? Had it always been there, just waiting to surface? It must have been. While John had loved Inga, Rita hadn't dared act on it. Perhaps prosperity truly did spoil people. When John's business was just getting by, he'd rush home after work to his wife and son. On weekends they'd have simple picnics in the old park, flying kites, while their little son Jamie squealed with joy. Inga had missed the first signs of trouble. Maybe she shouldn't have taken over as chief accountant after Nina Peterson's dismissal. But John had been desperate then, unable to afford an experienced specialist. Or maybe she shouldn't have brought Rita into their business. Yes, they studied together. Yes, they'd been friends. But who says you must hire friends? Rita hadn't just slipped her those illegal documents. She'd started an affair with John too. And John, how convenient for him. Wife, mistress, and work all under one roof. No need to stretch himself thin, especially now that business was booming and he could afford far more than a hamburger in a public park. Inga wondered if he still flew kites with their son. No way to know now. That dreadful day when the tax office came inquiring about those documents was seared in her memory. Inga hadn't immediately recalled that Rita had prepared them. Only later, seeing her false sympathy and hearing her exaggerated sighs, did she grasp the truth. It wasn't surprising, really. Their friendship had grown hollow long ago, especially after she'd noticed Rita's flirtation with John. Why hadn't she been alarmed when her husband refused to fire Rita, even after discovering the inflated estimates? He had protected Rita but abandoned his wife. Now she was divorced, homeless and jobless, and Jamie remained with him. Thoughts of her son sent sharp pain through Inga's heart. How could she regain custody with her reputation and salary? No court would rule against the father, but she'd fight on. She had to. The office porch loomed ahead. Inga took a deep breath and walked past the smoking managers, keeping her head high. They didn't mock her this time. Good. It's another test for her. It seems that it wasn't enough to forgive her ex-friend and ex-husband. She had to endure these people too, with their barbed words and squeamish attitude. But Inga had no choice. Otherwise, she'd become like them and lose herself. She wondered, had they arrived this way, or had the environment gradually shaped them? Probably the latter. People were fragile, fallible creatures. Fear of losing jobs, bonuses, or social standing broke many spirits. George Vale encouraged this culture, and it was totally unclear for Inga how could such an excellent director as Jacob Eriksson work with such a deputy. Perhaps opposites truly did attract. Enough reflection. Time to clean, Inga said to herself, and go to work. Today was deep cleaning day, and the chief's office needed special attention. By day's end, her muscles ached and her back was stiff. But the office gleamed with spotless windows, polished floors and shining furniture. With a satisfied smile, Inga adjusted the crystal globe on the principal's desk and prepared to leave. She needed to visit Frederick Irons today to begin moving her things. Frederick Irons had been a blessing of fate, sent to Inga in these unbearable times. She still remembered the fear that gripped her at the checkout counter when she discovered her last banknote had vanished from her jacket pocket, leaving her unable to pay. This meant 2 days of starvation, nothing at home but tea. In her moment of complete confusion and tears, a kind-hearted old man, standing behind her, came to her rescue, paying for her purchase and saving her from hunger. In response to her warm thanks, the old man smiled broadly, his eyes twinkling with kindness. "My child, you're probably still hungry. Come to my place for some tea. You'll warm up, and I'll have company for my lonely evening." Frederick Irons' apartment was like him, Clean, neat, bright, with nothing superfluous. They sat drinking tea until past midnight, sharing stories of their difficult lives. When they finally noticed the time, the old man wouldn't let his guest leave. Instead, he led her to a small, cosy room. "You shouldn't be wandering around at this hour. You're a young, beautiful woman, and there are too many troublemakers about. Stay here. Sleep well on the couch until morning." With that, Frederick Irons brought her out fresh bedding and wished Inga good night. The next morning, sipping steaming tea, he made her an offer. "Listen, Inga, stop struggling alone. I live in this 3-bedroom apartment, sometimes feeling lost in all this space. That room you slept in stands empty. Perhaps it's been waiting for you. Why not move in permanently? Just pitch in to pay the utilities, and that's it." Inga hesitated to accept the tempting offer immediately. Who knew? The elderly man had taken pity on her difficult situation, but might he regret it later? Sharing tea for an evening was one thing, seeing a stranger in his home daily was another. So Inga promised to consider it and began visiting Frederick Irons occasionally. Gradually her fears proved groundless. The landlord always welcomed her warmly, asked about her life, praised the pies and pancakes she brought, and would playfully wag his finger as she left. "Think it over, girl, and do agree." After finding the old man unwell during her last visit, with heart medicine under his tongue, Inga made her decision. She would both gain proper housing and look after him. She'd never forgive herself if something happened to her benefactor alone in his apartment. So today, after work, Inga headed to what would be her new home. To her surprise, nobody answered her persistent ringing. Growing concerned, Inga tried again. Soon she heard unfamiliar, energetic footsteps, and the door opened to reveal a brash young man who glared at her. "What do you want? Who are you?" "I'm here to see Frederick Irons," Inga replied, taken aback. "He wasn't feeling well last time, and I agreed to stay with him to help." "Not necessary," the stranger smirked. "What do you mean?" Inga asked, growing uneasy. The young man laughed harshly. "What, you think grandfather's dead or something? Don't worry, he's fine. I'm his son, back in my homeland to look after my father. You can go about your business. We'll manage without you." The door slammed shut, leaving no chance for further explanation. Son? But Frederick Irons had told her he hadn't spoken to his son in years, after refusing to sell and split the apartment following his wife's death, and his son should be older. Gathering her courage, Inga rang again. The door opened faster this time, but the young man looked even more hostile. "Why are you still ringing? Didn't you understand the first time?" "I want to see Frederick Irons," Inga said firmly. "I'll just check how he's doing and leave." "Such nerve," the young man sneered. "He's sleeping. Want me to wake the old man just for you?" The door slammed again, leaving Inga stranded. Her anxiety grew into genuine fear. Something felt wrong. If Frederick Irons were truly sleeping, wouldn't this door slamming have woken him? What was really happening? Inga regretted her long deliberation about moving in. If she were already living there, she could have insisted on entering to retrieve her belongings. But her possessions remained in the heavy bag she carried, never having made it to their intended new home. She had no authority to demand identification from this suspicious character, and he seemed unlikely to provide any. The only thing left to do was to go to the place where Inga had not expected justice for a long time. With a broken heart, Inga went to the police station. The policeman was no more welcoming than Frederick Irons's unexpected guest. "What are you trying to tell me? A relative has come, so what? Should he wake the old man and present him as evidence? Why would he do that? Just because he doesn't inspire confidence in you? Who are you to demand his confidence? You said yourself the old man and his son had quarrelled over the apartment. Maybe he came to make peace, and here you are complaining. Who would welcome you in such a situation? What if your grandfather decides to make a will for you. Do you know how common such cases are? Of course not. You're trying to play Agatha Christie. What's your last name? Marple or Poirot? Please go about your business. I have more pressing matters, a violent husband and unconscious parents who can't explain to their child that fists solve nothing. If you discover an actual crime, you're welcome to return. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss. Inga left the district officer, panting with resentment and powerlessness. She had never played at being Agatha Christie. She wasn't even a fan of detective stories. But now she was forced to investigate, while the authorities couldn't see beyond their own noses. She couldn't abandon Frederick Irons to this strange man. Something told her he wasn't really his son. No, she couldn't give up. He couldn't forbid her from seeing the old man. Inga decided to return to the apartment tomorrow after work. The next day, gathering her courage, Inga rang the firmly locked door again. The same young man appeared, now with frowning eyebrows. Through the gap in the door, Inga noticed a short, stern man in an immaculate suit, carefully placing papers and a seal into a black leather folder. Something about this rigid demeanour seemed suspicious. When she firmly demanded to see Frederick, dead or alive, the young man gritted his teeth and went to the bedroom. They returned with Frederick, supporting him by the arm. "Frederick, what's wrong? Are you ill?" Inga rushed to the old man, frightened, but he didn't recognise her. He barely responded to anything. His vacant gaze wandered aimlessly, his hands trembling. A large bruise marked the crook of his elbow. "Well, my dear, satisfied now?" The supposed son's voice was harsh and unpleasant. "You see, my father is ill and needs rest. No time for visitors. Go about your business and let the old man recover." But Inga wouldn't back down and went to the police again. This time she confronted the policeman with such fury, demanding justice, that he couldn't brush her off. Grumbling unhappily, he donned his tunic and accompanied her to the elderly man's apartment. Predictably, the suspicious man in the suit had vanished. The young man behaved respectfully towards the authority figure, readily producing both his and his father's passports. Both showed they were Irons, natives of this town. Frederick was asleep, undisturbed by either doorbell or hallway conversations. "Well, father's an old man," the son shrugged. "He's sleeping, not feeling well." The policeman made his excuses and practically dragged Inga out by her arm, hissing at the door. "How long will you keep disturbing people's lives? Troublemakers like you never stop. Satisfied now? I've seen the passport, same surname. Come here again and I'll charge you with false reporting. Remember that." Unable to face going home, Inga found herself at work. The office was empty except for the soft keyboard clicks from the director's office. Consumed by worry and suspicion, she began watering the plants to calm her nerves. The director caught her there. "Inga, what are you doing here? Working a second shift? You know we don't pay overtime." He attempted to joke. Inga, startled by her boss's voice, hesitated at first, but then, finally breaking under days of extreme tension, told Jacob Erickson everything. "Wow!" The principal scratched the tip of his nose thoughtfully. "All this smells like something criminal, and no one cares except for you, of course. Too bad you don't have the key to the elderly man's apartment." "We could have worked something out." "Why not? I do have a key. He gave it to me a couple of weeks ago when I found him having a heart attack in his apartment. I just hadn't used it yet. It felt awkward." "Well, that changes everything." The director perked up. "I have an idea. We bought a tape recorder with plenty of memory for the office. I'd rather not remember why, but it helped solve certain problems. We could hide it at Frederick's place, might learn something interesting." "I'll do it," said Inga thoughtfully. "There's a gap under the sofa that should fit the recorder perfectly. Just show me how to set it up." "Come on, it's in my safe." The director nodded and went to his office. For nearly 3 hours, Inga guarded Frederick Irons's apartment door from the technical floor. Sure, this supposed son would go out for beer or cigarettes. Or should she wait until he falls asleep? No, too risky. Nervously, Inga finished her 5th sandwich, saved for just such a stakeout. Suddenly the apartment door creaked open, and the familiar troublemaker rattled his keys, clearly heading out. Inga came down as soon as the entrance door slammed. She had to hurry. He might just be running to the corner store. The lock turned easily. Inside, only Frederick's heavy breathing broke the silence. Inga tried to wake him, but it was useless. The injection had clearly been strong. There was no time to waste. She quickly set up the recorder under the bed and fled the apartment, escaping through the emergency exit on the 1st floor to avoid the returning criminal. She had no doubt that's what he was, a real criminal. For the next 24 hours of recording time, Inga slept like the dead. The stress had worn her out. Thankfully, the director had given her time off for this purpose. Waking up ravenous in the afternoon, she emptied her meagre food supplies and returned to her post. This time, the wait was shorter. The guy went out to take the trash. Time was tight, but Inga had no choice. She rushed in, confirmed the elderly man was alive, though still unconscious, retrieved the recorder, and bolted for the exit. Heavy footsteps echoed from below. No time for keys. She carefully released the latch and pulled the door shut. Too risky to run up to the technical floor, so she climbed to the next floor and froze in the stairwell, heart pounding. The latch was closed completely, and the unsuspecting guy disappeared into the dark apartment. At home, Inga played back the recording. After ages of just TV noise, bathroom sounds, and the elderly man's groans, a phone finally rang. The guy answered irritably. "Yes, what's up? No way. The old man's passing out from just a quarter dose now. I don't get it. At first 1 dose made him so crazy he couldn't sign his name, and now he's completely out of it. What do you mean, stop? He won't sign anything without the dose. Yeah, when he's normal again, I'll call Dave right away. We need to finish this. It's dragged on too long. He's reacting weird to the drug. Nobody else ever reacted like this. He either passes out completely or the dose doesn't affect him. I can't get the dosage right. Good thing that stupid hen's gone. She nearly exposed the whole operation. All right, later." This time, Inga went straight to the head of the police department. Now she had real evidence. They listened with great interest. Apparently these black realtors were already under investigation. After receiving thanks for her vigilance and creativity, Inga headed to Frederick's place to await the outcome. Events were unfolding rapidly. The ambulance and the car with operatives entered the courtyard almost simultaneously. The sturdy officers entered one by one and soon got out with a familiar thug who was handcuffed. The paramedics who went in after them carried out the half-unconscious Frederick on a stretcher. "What about him? Will he live? Where are you taking him?" Inga rushed to the ambulance. "Most likely he will live," replied the tired paramedic. "We are taking him to the Central Clinical Centre. If you want to know his condition, go there." A few days later, returning from the now recovered Frederick, Inga came face to face with the district officer. He said hello, glanced sideways, and said, "How is the old man? Is he recovering a little?" "He is. He's already walking around the ward. His hands are shaking less. Do you know anything about those who tortured him?" "Yes, we do. We got them. It's not the first time they've been exposed, but there was no evidence before. This time it got tricky. Frederick didn't react as expected to their drugs. They had their own notary, and they found a junkie with his surname to sign over the apartment. But the man was unpredictable. Frederick once told me that he had paradoxical reactions to drugs. That's why he was very afraid of anesthesia if he ever needed an operation," Inga said thoughtfully. "Listen, I'm sorry about before. It's a tough job. Everyone makes mistakes. You did well. You didn't give up. You saw it through. If you need anything, contact me. I'll always help," said the officer awkwardly. "Thank you, but I'd really prefer never to have a reason to bother you again," Inga answered honestly, and went to prepare Frederick's favourite meal for her visit tomorrow. The next morning, while dusting the director's desk, Inga discovered a package of documents for a new contract. The counterparty was painfully familiar from her past, pre-trial life. She couldn't put the document down, and, hands trembling, began to read the contract. It was shocking. This was a well-established scheme. She, Inga, had fallen victim to one of its variants. Now they seemed to be targeting Jacob Eriksson. She had to wait for him. Entering his office, the director was surprised to find Inga examining the papers from his desk. "Inga, weren't you taught as a child that it's not good to snoop through other people's desks? Or did I promote you to deputy without remembering?" he asked ironically. "No, not at all," the woman flared up but quickly composed herself. "I apologize for overstepping, but I know this firm. The fact that I'm now just a cleaner with a suspended criminal record, instead of a chief accountant with an unblemished reputation, is partly their doing. I started reading because I don't want the same thing to happen to you." "Well, this day promises to be interesting," Jacob said, settling into his leather armchair. "Please tell me both your story and your thoughts on this contract, especially since George Vale has already given me his opinion." He pressed the secretary's button. "Natalia, no visitors, please." As concisely as possible, Inga explained her case and her suspicions about the new contract. As she spoke, Jacob's expression shifted from sympathetic to concerned, the crease between his eyebrows deepening. "So, at best, you'll be denied a tax credit and the firm will face losses. And at worst, you could lose either your freedom or your position," Inga concluded, arranging the contract papers. "Ah, George Vale, you old fox," the director said sarcastically. "Tired of being second in command, so you wanted the director's chair for yourself. Inga," his eyes suddenly lit up with an idea, "could you present this evidence to the management staff? I don't want this to seem like just a quarrel between top managers. Besides, there might be questions I can't answer." "But I'm just a cleaner to everyone," Inga protested uncertainly. "You were?" Jacob raised his index finger. "Were. And now things will change dramatically. I can guarantee that." The next day in the director's office, the department heads stared in amazement at Inga, seated at the end of the conference table. Or rather, they barely recognized her. The quiet woman in a lilac scarf had transformed into an elegant young lady with loose curls, wearing a business olive suit and a ruffled blouse. No one understood anything, but they didn't dare to ask. The meeting was urgent, and the chief was in a bad mood. It seemed wiser to sit quietly and wait. "Well, let's begin," said Jacob, pulling his chair to the conference table, while approvingly noting Inga's transformed appearance. "We have only one matter to discuss, the draft cooperation agreement that George Vale submitted. I have several questions about it, so I sought the advice from an impartial expert. Please welcome Inga Allen, a certified specialist in this field." Yes, don't be surprised. Life is full of surprises. Please, Inga, share your thoughts." Maintaining her composure despite perplexed and openly hostile looks, Inga focused on analysing the contract. She was oblivious to her colleagues' exchanged glances and shrugs, to George Vale's reddening face, to the lawyer who sat frozen, clutching his temples, as he realised what dangerous waters their firm had nearly entered. The long-forgotten thrill of working in her chosen profession emerged from its hidden corner, lifting her spirits and making her forget her troubles. When she finished, silence filled the room. The deputy director sat dark as a thundercloud, while others awaited the outcome. Jacob Eriksson, eyes gleaming with satisfaction, spoke. "Well, I believe everything is clear now. George Vale, out of respect for our history, I won't launch a formal investigation. I'll let you resign voluntarily. I trust you'll appreciate my generosity, and Inga, effective immediately, you'll assume the role of my deputy and take over George Vale's responsibilities. HR, please prepare the necessary paperwork. Everyone is dismissed." The meeting's participants remained seated, stunned. Only the disgraced deputy leaped up and stormed out, slamming the director's office door. "I congratulate you on this new chapter," the director concluded, giving Inga a conspiratorial wink. The new position captivated her. It proved to be the perfect remedy for her troubles. Inga flourished as she optimized the company's structure, redistributed employee duties, and implemented new software. During her daily reports to Jacob about financial improvements, she failed to notice how his face grew increasingly gentle and his eyes sparkled as she spoke. One day, finally noticing his expression, she stumbled over her words and lowered her eyes, blushing. "Don't stop, Inga," Jacob smiled. "I'm listening intently. It's just that you're so charming in your organizational enthusiasm. I can't help but want to invite you to dinner. How do you feel about the restaurant King's Hunt?" "I love its cuisine," Inga replied. The food proved exceptional. They chatted and laughed throughout the evening, forgetting about hierarchy and work concerns. He walked slowly down the street, his shoulders hunched against the weight of judgmental stares that followed his every step. In 3 years of wandering the city's streets, Jim had grown painfully accustomed to people's harsh remarks and whispered comments. "Aren't you ashamed? Such a young man, homeless. Go find yourself some work." Though Jim never stooped to begging or panhandling, the signs of his life on the streets were unmistakably evident. Threadbare clothes hanging loosely on his frame, a week's worth of dark stubble covering his gaunt face, and a distant, lost look haunting his tired eyes. Despite his determined efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity by meticulously washing his shabby clothes in the cold river water during the warmer months, and occasionally treating himself to visits to the public baths when he could scrape together enough coins for a ticket, the cruel label of vagrant seemed permanently affixed to his existence. In truth, he had never known the warmth of a real home. His mother had abandoned him at the maternity hospital. The reason for her devastating choice remained an aching mystery that tormented Jim. As a lonely child in the crowded orphanage, he'd spent countless nights crafting elaborate fantasies where one day she would suddenly appear, tears streaming down her face, and exclaim with joy, "Son, I've been searching for you for so long." In his most cherished daydreams, he imagined he'd been stolen from her arms at birth, creating a noble explanation for her absence. But these were nothing more than the desperate dreams of an unwanted child. She never came through those gates, never offered an explanation, never whispered an apology. No one seemed to want him. While some of the other boys were fortunate enough to find new families, Jim remained perpetually overlooked. He was painfully unremarkable in every way. No striking blue eyes to catch attention, no angelic, wavy hair to charm potential parents, no endearing freckles to make him memorable. Just hair the colour of last year's straw, and eyes of an indeterminate greyish that reminded everyone of a dusty wall in need of fresh paint. His personality wasn't particularly sweet or engaging either, prickly as a defensive hedgehog, always hovering on the periphery, preferring to be alone. And finally finishing school, he desperately yearned to join the army. Military service represented more than just a duty. It was his chance to completely transform his life, prove his worth to society, and explore the vast expanse of his country. But even this modest dream crumbled to dust when the stern-faced doctor at the medical commission rejected his application. His flat feet and seemingly minor heart condition immediately disqualified him from service. When Jim desperately pleaded with the military commissar for just one chance to prove himself, the man responded with genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Most young men try everything possible to avoid service. Yet here you are, practically begging to join. That's truly admirable, but I'm sorry, old boy, my hands are tied. I'd be held personally responsible if anything happened. Go, live your life instead. Study, find good work, fall in love. There are countless other ways to serve our society." Study, they all said with casual dismissal, but even after 18 long years, Jim still couldn't envision a clear path forward for himself. He secretly harboured ambitious dreams of becoming a respected sailor, a dedicated police officer, or even soaring through the skies as a pilot. But could someone like him ever achieve any of these lofty goals? His self-doubt ran impossibly deep, constantly reinforced by others who had carelessly labelled him since childhood as the fool. He could never find the strength to defend himself against these taunts because, as the gruff orphanage cleaner had repeatedly declared with disdain, he was hopelessly spineless. His one meaningful achievement in life was finally securing a modest one-room apartment from the state. He gradually settled into this tiny space, managed to find steady work as a construction labourer, and maintained that physically demanding job for several challenging years. Life seemed to be slowly improving. He even found what he believed was love. At least, he convinced himself it was genuine love. Nancy, a seemingly kind-hearted girl, worked diligently at a local pawn shop. She moved into his life quickly, and they appeared to live together in perfect harmony. When he accidentally discovered she had a young child being raised by her aging parents in a distant village, Jim, ever the gentleman and driven by his own painful childhood memories, insisted she bring her son to live with them and earnestly suggested marriage. Having grown up in the cold emptiness of an orphanage, he intimately understood a child's desperate need for maternal care. It felt fundamentally wrong to keep them separated. Nancy readily agreed to the marriage proposal, but carefully pointed out that this cramped one-room apartment would be far too small for 3 people to live comfortably. She cleverly suggested selling Jim's apartment and using the substantial money as a down payment for a proper mortgage on a larger place. Completely unfamiliar with the complex legal intricacies of property ownership, Jim trustingly allowed her to handle all the confusing paperwork. This blind trust proved catastrophically misplaced. By naively signing documents without proper check, he had unwittingly made Nancy the sole legal owner of his only possession. She wasted no time in selling the apartment and coldly evicting him from what had once been his sanctuary. She didn't do the dirty work herself. Instead, 2 menacing thugs forcefully removed him from the premises, making it crystal clear that any resistance would result in an extended stay in the hospital or something far worse. Though Jim immediately rushed to the local police station, seeking justice, everything was frustratingly legal and binding. According to the papers he had foolishly signed, he had officially gifted his apartment to Nancy, and she could legally dispose of it however she wished. And yet, Jim gathered his courage to stand up for his rights. With determination in his steps, he marched into Nancy's workplace and started arguing. But his weak attempt at justice was cut short when security personnel forcibly removed him from the premises. That same evening, in a dark alley near his temporary residence, the same threatening men caught up with him. Their brutal conversation left Jim with severe injuries that required an entire month of hospitalization. Despite police involvement, the perpetrators were never identified or apprehended. Upon his discharge from the hospital, Jim found himself in an impossible situation. His employers had terminated his employment, so the construction site trailer that had been his modest home wasn't available for him now, and his former co-workers, though sympathetic to his plight, avoided any contact. That first night of homelessness found Jim huddled on a cold park bench. In the days that followed, he discovered a network of underground shelters in various building basements, moving from one to another as circumstances required. Through sheer determination, he managed to secure part-time employment as a manual labourer and maintenance worker. When work was scarce, he learned to identify which store dumpsters contained salvageable food items, though this survival strategy often led to confrontation with other desperate individuals seeking the same resources. Street life in some way hardened Jim. He learned to survive in this world, yet not civilized, but at least so. However, despite his circumstances, he maintained an unwavering commitment to his personal standards, meticulously maintaining his hygiene, steadfastly refusing both alcohol and the companionship of other homeless individuals, and carefully allocating his meagre earnings toward essential items and sustenance. While his wardrobe consisted mainly of discarded clothing from waste bins, he took particular pride in occasionally purchasing new socks, a small luxury that helped him maintain his sense of dignity. Through it all, he clung tenaciously to the belief that his circumstances were temporary, that somewhere on the horizon waited an opportunity for positive change. In addition to other part-time jobs, Jim often went to the dump. Although there too everything is tough, all the heaps are literally divided between other brothers and sisters in misfortune. But Jim managed to snatch his piece, where he occasionally found non-ferrous metal, which he sold to a familiar bargainer. On this morning, Jim approached the dump with no expectations. He had missed the prime scavenging hours when fresh deliveries arrived, and he knew other collectors would have already combed through the most promising areas. Nevertheless, he maintained a glimmer of hope that something valuable might have escaped their notice. Like many in his situation, he often entertained fantasies of discovering hidden treasures, perhaps a misplaced suitcase filled with money, or an antique chair concealing valuable secrets. Though reality typically offered nothing more exciting than damaged furnishings, worn-out textiles, and occasional pieces of scrap metal. The junkyard appeared deserted when he arrived, exactly as he had anticipated. He methodically searched his usual territory before venturing into less familiar areas, acknowledging the likely futility of his efforts. Suddenly, his probe made contact with something unusual. His pulse quickened with familiar anticipation. Could this be the moment when his persistent dreams of a treasure finally materialized? Carefully extracting the object, he found himself holding an elegant woman's handbag. With mounting anticipation, he began his inspection. While cash seemed unlikely, he allowed himself to hope for jewelry or other valuables. He was deeply disappointed when the purse was empty. No money, no accessories, not even scattered coins at the bottom. He nearly discarded it immediately. After all, what use was an expensive accessory in his circumstances? Yet something made him hesitate at the last moment, and he decided to keep it, if only because it seemed wrong to throw away something so well made. Jim crumpled it in his hands, and then his fingers fumbled for the hidden zipper inside. Opening it revealed a folded sheet of notebook paper. Jim expected to find mundane contents like a shopping list, cooking instructions, or perhaps a romantic message. Instead, his eyes fell upon these words. "Help! I'm being held at some summer house. From the window I can see railroad tracks. A train stops here at 8:30 every morning for 2 minutes. Jim stood frozen, his mouth agape at this extraordinary discovery. His first impulse was to simply dispose of the note. and continue with his daily struggles. He certainly had enough challenges without involving himself in mysterious circumstances. However, a sobering realization struck him. He might be the only person who could offer assistance to someone in genuine peril. The handwriting in the note was smooth and neat. Jim concluded that it was probably written by a girl, especially since the bag was a woman's. Jim always had a keen sense of justice in his character, though he had never been able to defend himself. Yet, while he had failed to protect his own interests, perhaps he could succeed in rescuing another person from harm. For a brief moment, his mind wandered to practical considerations. Surely there would be some compensation for helping in such a situation. But he quickly dismissed these thoughts as unworthy. The true value for him lay not in any potential reward, but in the opportunity to assist another human being in dire circumstances. Jim moved decisively from the junkyard, clutching the note and bag. He headed straight for the police station, where a uniformed officer stopped him at the door. "Hey, where are you going?" the officer asked. "I have a statement," Jim replied, holding out the purse. "I found this at the dump." "So?" The officer wrinkled his nose in disgust. "There's a note inside saying someone is being held captive." The officer paused, then sighed with a smirk. "Are you drunk or something? What note? What nonsense is this?" "It's right here." Jim reached for the note, but the officer pushed him firmly away from the door. "Get out! There are no kidnapping reports in town. We'd know. What are you standing there for? Leave! Found a bag, did you? I'll throw you in the drunk tank, and we'll see where you really got it. You stole it, didn't you?" "No," Jim stumbled backward. "I found it." "Then count yourself lucky," the officer said with a laugh. Jim knew he needed to leave. The two officers stood nearby, watching the exchange with interest. As he walked away, he overheard their conversation. "Miguel, what did that bum want?" one called out. "Who cares? I'm not letting him mess up my statistics. It's month's end and he shows up with this nonsense. Probably drunk with his buddies playing detective. Looks like delirium tremens." "No surprise there. They're all like that," their colleague added. Jim felt crushed by their disbelief. They'd driven him away like a stray dog. The worst part was his inability to help the captive woman, despite his desperate wish to do good. Then inspiration struck. He could handle this himself. He just needed to figure out how. Sitting on a park bench, Jim unfolded the note. Though it lacked an address, it mentioned the summer house as a landmark. The train, location was now key. The train stops at 8:30 in the morning. But which train? He had a lead. Now he needed to check a schedule. Jim racked his brain for solutions. A phone would help, but his was long gone, lost or stolen, though it wouldn't matter with no money on his account. Then it hit him. The station's electronic train map would have everything. So the man headed to the station without delay. An hour later, he knew the name of the station where the train stopped for 2 minutes at 8:30. Unfortunately, there were no more trains today, so Jim asked the ticket cashier how he could get there another way. But the woman, who seemed disgusted by the homeless man's appearance, angrily hissed that she was not a reference bureau, and that giving out such information was not part of her job description. A storm was raging in Jim's soul. He wanted to cry out, "People, help! A person is in trouble!" But he remained silent as people hurried about their business, some rushing to catch trains, others returning from trips with heavy suitcases. No one noticed the poor soul in his thin, worn jacket as he tried to figure out how to get to the station he needed. "How long are you going to stand there?" a voice suddenly said near his ear. Jim flinched and looked up. Before him stood a broad-shouldered man in a janitor's uniform. "Sorry, I'll be right out," Jim replied sheepishly, rising from the bench. "I'm just trying to figure out how to get to the village. If not by train, then at least by bus. When the janitor heard the name of the station, he smiled kindly. Funny coincidence, my grandmother used to spend every summer in that village, growing tomatoes and cucumbers. My family sold the cottage later. There's a bus stop across the street. Your bus is number 45. Jim glanced uncertainly toward the station exit, then thanked the man and turned to leave. Hey, do you have a bus fare? The janitor called after him. Jim shook his head. That was the simple truth. Here, the man said, pressing a few bills into his hand. This should cover your fare and maybe a snack for the road. The shuttle bus arrived quickly. Throughout the journey, the other passengers eyed Jim's ragged appearance but remained silent. The driver paid him no mind. After all, the man had paid his fare. People got on and off along the way, while Jim stared out the window lost in thought. What would he do when he arrived? He couldn't just stand in the village centre shouting, "Who's locked up here?" He'd have to inspect the cottages, risk being mistaken for a thief. They'd either call the police or take matters into their own hands. Though Jim increasingly felt helpless, he pressed on. Finally, Jim stepped off the bus at a shabby stop. Beyond lay the cottage village, modest summer houses interspersed with a few imposing mansions. A typical Dasher settlement. Fortunately for Jim, there were no residents. It was mid-October, and the last of the gardeners had harvested their crops and departed. Only stray cats and dogs remained, abandoned by their negligent owners. He knocked on doors and peered through windows, but no one answered. Walking down the street, Jim eventually sank onto a bench near one of the houses. He was exhausted, hungry, cold, and directionless. Everything was pointless. He wouldn't find anyone here. Where would he sleep tonight? What would he eat? What a fool he'd been, giving in to this chivalrous impulse to rescue some phantom victim. There was no one here. Then he heard a car engine. Jim caught sight of the car, pulling away from the only luxurious cottage in the area. Could the victim be there? The railroad was visible from that side. It was worth investigating. Jim decided to examine the mansion's grounds. After the car disappeared around the corner, he approached the gate and pulled. Locked, of course. A security camera loomed on a nearby pole. Jim surveyed the neighbouring plot and realised he could access the yard undetected through it. The fence there was lower, just wooden boards with no visible cameras. Jim smirked. These rich folks think thieves only use the front door. But he wasn't a thief. He was on a noble mission. Gathering his courage, he scaled the fence and surveyed the yard. The yard was empty. He jerked open the front door. Locked. "Hello?" he shouted into the keyhole, pressing his ear against it. Silence. Then Jim went to the outbuildings. "Is anyone alive?" he called out several times. Only pressing silence answered. Then came a noise from an old barn that stood out among the newer buildings. A faint knock sounded from inside the door. "Help!" came a woman's voice, quiet but tearful, as if drawing its last breath. Jim rushed to the doors. They were sturdy, secured with a huge padlock. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jim shouted. "How did you get in there?" "He locked me in. Help!" the female voice called back. "Did you write the note?" "Yes, help!" The woman's voice suggested she was close to fainting. There was no time to waste. Jim scanned the area for something to break the lock, but found only well-manicured lawn grass everywhere. He circled the barn and spotted a small window under the roof, barely large enough for a cat. Then his eyes fell on a small crowbar leaning against the neighbouring house's wall, alongside a shovel and rake, clearly forgotten by careless owners. What luck! In moments, Jim had retrieved the crowbar and returned to the barn door. "Are you all right in there?" he called out. "Bad! Help!" came the barely audible response. Jim attacked the lock with the crowbar. Though unusually strong, the lock finally gave way. and he swung the barn door open. A short, frail girl collapsed into his arms. "Thank you," she whispered through blood-cracked lips before losing consciousness. Jim carried her back the way he had come. As he reached the road, he saw a police car approaching, lights flashing. It turned out not all the village residents had left. An elderly woman had spotted what she thought was a homeless man prowling around, peering through windows and doors. Frightened he might be a thief or worse, she had called the police. The officers, seeing Jim with the unconscious girl, ordered him to surrender, or they would draw their weapons. "I haven't done anything bad," he mumbled. "I only wanted to help her." "Save it for the station," the officers replied, roughly handcuffing him and putting him in their car. They waited for an ambulance to take the girl to the hospital before driving to the station. At the station, Jim explained why he had come to the Dasher settlement. "You're spinning fairy tales," the investigator scoffed. "To hear you tell it, you're Poirot or Margret himself. Come clean. How long have you been casing those houses? Where's your stash? Or have you drunk away all the proceeds? What did you do to the girl?" "I'm Jim Squibb, just an ordinary man," he replied steadily. "Not a thief, not a murderer, not a rapist. I went to your colleagues first, but they dismissed me, so I acted alone. I found the girl. How is she doing?" "Still unconscious," the investigator said curtly, "but the doctors expect her to recover. Don't think you're off the hook. Her testimony will sink you for sure." "I look forward to hearing her story," Jim said. "You might want to investigate the house's owner while you're at it." "Are you, the worthless vagrant, trying to tell me how to do my job?" The investigator's face flushed with anger. He called the duty officer, and Jim was taken to a holding cell. Jim went quietly and obediently. Truth be told, he was grateful for a warm place to sleep. When they brought him dinner, cold porridge and a piece of bread, even that seemed a blessing to the unfortunate man. In the morning he was awakened by the clanking of keys. The door to the cell opened, and yesterday's interrogator peeped in. "What, you asleep, vagabond?" The detective grinned. "Get up, you're on your way out." "And where am I going now?" Jim resigned himself to his fate. "You're going home," the investigator smiled. "I'll draw up the paperwork now. The girl told me everything, it's not your fault." In his office, the investigator briefly informed him that Jim was no longer suspected of anything. "And did they find the one who held her?" Jim inquired. "Found?" the investigator replied dryly. "And you're still a witness. We wrote everything down from your words. If we need anything, we'll find you." Jim understood the reason for this uncertainty. There was negligence for law enforcement. He had reported the kidnapping immediately, but they hadn't believed him. However, Jim didn't want to prove anything. They hadn't arrested him. The girl was saved, and that was enough. Walking out of the police station, Jim breathed in the crisp fall air. It was over. He had done it. Saved someone. Sure, they hadn't believed him at first, and no one had even said thank you. It stung a bit, but it wasn't terrible. The main thing was that the girl was safe, and Jim now knew something about himself. He wasn't a coward. Though he had nowhere in particular to go, he slowly moved away from the police station. An expensive car stopped nearby, and a middle-aged man got out, walking quickly toward the door. For some reason he stared at the vagrant. Jim paid little attention, but after a couple of minutes he heard a shout. "Jim! Jim Squibb! Stop, please!" Hearing his name, he froze and slowly turned around. On the threshold stood the investigator and the same man. The latter headed toward him. "Jim, it's you!" he exclaimed cheerfully. "I'm here on behalf of Leslie. I want to thank you." "Leslie? Thank me?" Jim muttered confusedly. "Yes, I'm the father of the girl you saved yesterday. If it hadn't been for you, it's frightening to imagine what might have happened. Let's go to the car." The man gestured towards his vehicle. "There's no need to," Jim mumbled. Are you hungry? The man looked at him thoughtfully. Jim lowered his eyes. The only porridge and bread from last evening was all he'd had in 24 hours. He was hungry, but he wasn't used to begging. Even homeless, he had always earned his own food. Reading all these thoughts on Jim's face, the man resolutely took him by the arm and led him firmly toward the car. Jim obeyed. "We're going to a good place. They have great food there," the man said, starting the engine. "My name is Mr. Faustino, by the way." Jim. "I know," Mr. Faustino laughed. "The investigator told me. Oh, Jim, I'm so glad I caught you. You're a real hero. Thank you." "I didn't do anything special," Jim replied modestly. "The main thing is that your daughter is safe." "Well, not quite safe. She'll have to stay in the hospital for a while because of that jerk. She's dehydrated and has pneumonia, but the doctors say it's not critical. You got there just in time. Just one more day, and that would have been it," Mr. Faustino said, driving confidently. Jim was silent, only nodding in response. He wanted to ask questions. Why the girl was in the barn? Who had kept her there? But he was too shy. Mr. Faustino would tell him later. At the entrance of an expensive restaurant, Jim hesitated and tried to refuse, but the man again took him firmly by the sleeve. "He's with me," he told the guard. He was surprised, but let it pass. It was clear that Mr. Faustino was well known here, and could afford some oddities, even bringing in a homeless man. Sitting in a private office, surrounded by the exquisite dishes Mr. Faustino had ordered, Jim learned his entire dramatic story. Mr. Faustino owned a successful business with several branches in different cities. He had a wife and a student daughter, and life was good, until a week ago, when his daughter Leslie didn't return home from university. They searched social networks and called all her friends and acquaintances, but no one knew anything. Just as they were about to contact the police, they received a call. An unfamiliar male voice informed them that he had Leslie, warning that if they wanted to see her alive, they shouldn't involve the police. The stranger demanded Mr. Faustino's entire business, everything he was worth, in exchange for Leslie's return. When Mr. Faustino explained this was impossible to do immediately, the kidnapper gave him a week's deadline. Despite the warning, Mr. Faustino contacted a familiar detective for advice. The detective promised to track down the kidnapper, but agreed they shouldn't go to the police. A few days later, the detective claimed to have found where Leslie might be held, but the lead proved false. Meanwhile, the kidnapper kept calling with reminders and demands. As time ran out, the girl's father began preparing documents to sell his business, too terrified for his daughter's life to contact the police. Then suddenly, he received word that Leslie was in a city hospital. When he and his wife arrived, Leslie was already conscious and told them everything. That day she'd left the university and encountered the detective her father occasionally hired for minor matters. His name was Nigel. He was about 30, and the naive 20-year-old girl had taken a liking to him. When Nigel offered her a ride, she accepted. During the drive, he gave her a cup of coffee, and after that, she had some kind of blackout in her memory. She awoke in a cold shed. It was night, she was terrified, and her phone was missing from her coat pocket. Though she screamed for help, no one heard her. By morning, exhausted on the damp floor, she was startled awake by a train horn. Through a wall crack, she spotted a railroad nearby with a passenger train at a stop. Leslie checked her watch, which thankfully remained on her wrist, and memorized the time. Using some empty crates, she managed to peer through a high window, discovering she was being held in a farm building within what appeared to be a dasher settlement. After analyzing her situation, she decided to write a note to throw from the window. Finding a notebook and pen in her purse, she described her surroundings in case the wind carried her message far away. Just as she finished writing, she heard footsteps. She quickly tucked the note into her purse before the door opened, revealing Nigel, no longer the charming man she had known, but a monster. When Leslie tried to scream, he taped her mouth shut, bound her hands, took her purse and left. She didn't see him again for days, though she heard him visit the dasher occasionally and approach her door, likely watching through a crack. He never entered or spoke to her. It seemed he was simply waiting for her to perish. After several days, she managed to free her hands and remove the tape, but her voice was gone, and she lacked the strength to make noise. Having had neither food nor water all this time, she had developed a fever. Just when she thought it was the end, she heard an unfamiliar man's voice. Before losing consciousness, she rushed to the door, remembering only that she saw a destitute man, probably homeless, but she didn't care. The main thing was that he was a man. Then, darkness. She woke up in the hospital. Nigel was detained this morning when he tried to flee at the airport after returning to the village and finding Leslie gone. Finishing his story, Mr. Faustino said, "I never expected him to do that. I trusted him, and he almost destroyed my daughter." "Why did he go through with it?" Jim asked. "Surely he must have known that even if he got the money he couldn't escape. Leslie would tell everything." "He wasn't planning to let her live," Mr. Faustino replied, his voice filled with pain. "As for the money, trust me, that creep would have figured something out. You stopped his plans. You don't realize what you've done for us. You saved both our daughter and our business. The money doesn't matter. What matters is that Leslie is alive." Mr. Faustino fell silent for a moment before asking, "Now tell me, young man, what's happening in your life?" "Not much," Jim replied sadly. "I've been searching through dumps, which is where I found Leslie's purse." "Well, that was fortunate," Mr. Faustino exclaimed, then quickly added, "But I was not asking about the situation with finding the purse. Jim, I gather you have nowhere to live. Why is that?" Jim briefly shared his sad story. Mr. Faustino listened carefully before offering his help, something Jim hadn't expected but gratefully accepted. Mr. Faustino started by renting an apartment for him, helped him buy clothes and arranged a job for him. Though it was only as a courier, it was just the beginning. Mr. Faustino also promised to help Jim enroll in college after summer. He could work and study. There was still time to catch up if he had the motivation. And Jim did have the motivation. He discovered his calling, to become a lawyer. He stayed friends with Leslie and found true love with Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital where he had had his medical check. At first he couldn't understand why Sarah loved him, a poor man without a good background. He even asked her about it. "What a silly thing," Sarah laughed. "You're the best man in the world. I feel safe with you." These words gave Jim renewed strength. Now he knows for certain that he's not worthless, and he will succeed. Being at the bottom isn't the worst thing. What's worse is having no chance to rise again, having no one extend a helping hand. And in that, he's been fortunate.
Jeremy needs new slippers for kindergarten. I also have to pay the utility bills. And Molly has been begging for a new doll. Mandy thought, calculating her advance payment expenses on the shuttle bus to work. It was payday, and beyond groceries, she had to consider other essential purchases and payments. Money was always desperately short. The children quickly outgrew their clothes, asked for sweets, and her salary as a hardware store saleswoman barely covered their needs. Her ex-husband refused to help, though occasionally he bought fruit or candy, always specifying it was only for his son. Mandy avoided filing for alimony, knowing his lifestyle and fearing he would drain money from the children in his old age. Chuck had never truly worked, despite his teaching degree. He insisted teaching was women's work,
and refused to wipe schoolchildren's noses. His attitude had roots in his upbringing. His late mother had merely forced him to attend the college to obtain any diploma. Mrs. Miller was a photojournalist, and after Chuck's birth father died when he was 6, the woman started to go away on business trips abroad. There, Mrs. Miller made good money, showering the child with gifts, indulging his every whim. All this in a try to compensate for her absence and ensure her son's happiness. Besides, after a while, she found there a wealthy widower and got married to him. Chuck didn't want to live abroad, so he stayed in Mother's home. Mandy's mother-in-law maintained a good relationship with her. Knowing her son wouldn't hurry to seek employment, the woman sent monthly money transfers and gifts. She was also the one who insisted they adopt Jeremy. Chuck and Mandy had been childless for 10 years. At first, Mandy felt uncertain about this idea, but her husband, ever obedient to his mother, convinced her to visit the children's home. There, they met a 2-year-old boy from a troubled family. He had enormous sad eyes, didn't speak, and struggled to connect with others, hiding constantly behind the caregivers. After being removed from his good-for-nothing mother's care, Jeremy spent several weeks in the hospital, recovering from severe malnutrition. He grew attached to one of the nurses and suffered deeply when they parted. Though small, he carried the look of an adult who had seen too much of life. Jeremy had lost his trust in adults. Mandy and Chuck visited him every day at the orphanage, brought him presents and went for walks together. Slowly, the boy thawed out, even smiling when he saw his new parents. While immersed in preparing documents, visiting authorities and bonding with Jeremy, Mandy finally released the burden of thoughts about having her own child, who had weighed on her for years. A month after her son moved in with them, she discovered she was pregnant. The happy woman shared the joyful news with her husband and was shocked by his reaction. "Mandy, let's handle this medically before it's too late. We can't afford 2 children at once. Jeremy is already 2 years old and in kindergarten. When the baby comes, you'll have to take maternity leave. We can't live on my mother's help alone. Our apartment is too small, just 2 rooms. Where would we put another child?" "What are you saying? This is our child, so long awaited," Mandy said in disbelief. "And what about Jeremy? Back to the orphanage?" Chuck pressed. "I grew up with just a mother, and I can't imagine how I would have felt if she had another child." "I won't terminate it. Don't even suggest it," Mandy replied tearfully. After this conversation, Chuck rarely came home. He had previously had affairs, which his wife knew about, hoping this phase would eventually pass. She even convinced herself that he loved her deeply, since he always returned home. What mattered most to her was that her husband didn't drink. He might occasionally have some wine, but alcohol made him ill, so she never saw him drunk. This was why Mandy had married him, believing herself fortunate. Her late father had been an alcoholic. When drunk, he would lose all humanity, destroying everything around him and beating anyone in sight, sometimes even little Mandy, who spent most of her childhood hiding under her bed. At first, she prayed her father would stop drinking. Later, she began wishing he would die. These thoughts terrified her, and feeling wicked, she would kneel, begging God's forgiveness. However, her father, 20 years dead, still haunted her dreams, always chasing and trying to catch her. When Molly was born and placed at her mother's breast, screaming loudly, Mandy felt truly needed for the first time in her life. She looked into her little daughter's eyes and realized she no longer needed to win love. For the first time, she was loved simply for existing. Previously, Mandy had always had to seek recognition. As a child, she fawned over her father, afraid of him. She remained obedient and affectionate to please her mother, who disliked her for her resemblance to her drunkard husband and blamed her for ruining her life. As a teenager, she worked tirelessly around the house like a bee, so her strict grandmother with whom her mother had left her after the divorce, wouldn't send her to boarding school. In marriage, she stayed perpetually poised and beautiful for Chuck to keep him from straying to mistresses. She also tried her best to please her mother-in-law. Then was the struggle to win Jeremy, who, like a wolf cub, resisted accepting his new mum. Mandy was taken from the hospital by her mother-in-law and mother. The presence of the latter surprised her, but over time she noticed how reverently her mother treated her grandchildren. This both pleased and saddened Mandy. While she was glad her children grew up loved by both grandmothers, she never understood why she herself couldn't earn her mother's love. Chuck, during his occasional appearances at home, defiantly ignored Molly and never failed to reproach Mandy for depending on his mother's financial support with 2 children. However, after giving birth to her daughter, Mandy had changed. She no longer tried desperately to keep the family together, finally beginning to respect herself. One day she told her husband he should be ashamed of living off his mother at 37. Though Chuck was hurt, Mandy pressed on. "You've never held a proper job. I'm sick of your wild business schemes. The apartment you live in, I inherited from my grandmother. What do you have? Just monthly allowances from your mother's wealthy husband and rent money from your mother's house? You are nothing. Zero. What about you? No education, no job. Now you're on maternity leave. Tell me, who would want you with 2 kids in tow, except me?" Chuck snapped. "The children need me, and that's what matters most," Mandy replied wearily, meeting his eyes. Chuck shuddered at her gaze. Something had changed in it. She looked at him critically now, not submissively as before. He spun around and stormed out, slamming the door. About a week later, he called, proposing an amicable divorce, saying he'd fallen in love with another woman, younger, childless, and unburdened. Mandy agreed. She no longer feared loneliness, especially since her husband contributed nothing to the household. Her mother-in-law, upon learning of the divorce, promised continued support for her grandchildren and urged Mandy not to rush into finding work, particularly since there was no one to care for tiny Molly. Her mother also helped her several times, but her health prevented her from watching the little ones. A year later, Mrs. Miller passed away, just 1 day shy of her 60th birthday. They couldn't say goodbye, as she was buried abroad. Mandy deeply mourned this wise and kind woman who had supported her for so many years. With no one left to help financially, she had to work. Molly was enrolled in the nursery at Jeremy's kindergarten, and Mandy found work as a saleswoman in a hardware store at the Central Market. She enjoyed her job, had regular customers, and the location was busy, providing a decent salary plus bonuses. The owner was an elderly, good-natured man named Kenneth. 3 months ago, he had hired Mandy a partner, a vivacious, giggly Dahlia, whom she quickly befriended. Dahlia often visited during Mandy's shifts, bringing coffee and offering to cover when needed. Once, Mandy noticed expensive laundry capsules from the store in Dahlia's bag, but assumed she'd bought them elsewhere, where they were cheaper. Rushing from the shuttle bus one morning, Mandy hurried to open the store 5 minutes before schedule. Kenneth had promised to pay advances that morning before leaving to restock supplies. Dahlia was already inside and greeted Mandy with an unusually curt "hello," avoiding eye contact. The owner looked thunderous. He'd conducted an evening audit and discovered significant losses. "Mandy, I understand if you need money, I'll lend it to you. But I can't accept being deceived by someone I trust," Kenneth said. "I don't understand. What's happened?" asked the bewildered woman. "I've noticed shortages after your shifts more than once. I thought they might be mistakes, but here we are again. I won't tolerate theft. Have I ever shortchanged you?
I know you're raising children alone, but I have children and grandchildren too. They also need to eat," the shopkeeper admonished. When her eyes met Dahlia's, who immediately looked away, Mandy realized it all at once. "Kenneth, I'm sorry you feel that way about me. I've never stolen a penny from anyone, and I thought that by working for you for more than a year now, I had earned your trust. Well, let's consider this misunderstanding forgotten. I deducted the shortfall from your advance. Just don't ever do that in the future," the owner said sternly. "How much did you deduct?" Mandy asked, her voice trembling. "Of course your advance doesn't cover the shortfall, but I'll forgive the debt," Kenneth answered calmly. "What? I worked for half a month for free? We won't survive another 2 weeks until payday without any money," Mandy said, horrified. "Look at this. I show mercy and she still complains. Be grateful I didn't call the police. That's it. Get back to work," the owner shouted. "No, you work here yourself. I don't work for free, just to face another shortage at the end of the month," she snapped and stormed out of the store. Mandy knew exactly why those washing capsules had appeared in Dahlia's purse, and why there had been those friendly visits outside her shift. Dahlia was setting her up, but she had no way to prove it. What hurt most was that Kenneth had believed her capable of theft. Mandy felt sick with worry. She had no money left, not even for groceries. She slumped onto a bench and pulled out her phone to browse job listings. A posting for a nurse position for an elderly woman caught her attention immediately. The pay was impressive, 1.5 times what she'd made at the store. Though skeptical it might be a scam, Mandy called the employer's number. A woman answered, introducing herself as the secretary of a Mr. Paul Fulken, and invited her for an immediate interview after providing the address. The address led to a 4-story building, the headquarters of a grocery store chain. Surprised, Mandy went inside and explained her purpose to the guard, who directed her to the 2nd floor. Several people, mostly students, were waiting outside a door marked CEO. After about 30 minutes, Mandy's turn came. She entered to find a handsome, broad-shouldered man in his 40s who greeted her with a warm smile and gestured toward a chair. "Why are you looking for a job as a caregiver?" Mr. Falcon asked warmly. "To be honest, I wasn't specifically looking for a nursing position. I need any job that can provide an income," Mandy answered sincerely. "Do you have a medical degree or relevant experience?" the man continued. "I don't have medical training, but I cared for my bedridden grandmother for several years. I can give injections, handle hygiene care, and assist with feeding," Mandy replied. "Fortunately, Mrs. Addison is fairly independent. She mainly needs supervision due to her heart condition and difficulty getting out of bed. The role involves ensuring she takes her medications on time and providing companionship," the man explained. "If you're interested, I can arrange your arriving immediately. Mrs. Addison is my mother-in-law. We live outside the city, but don't worry about commuting. Our chauffeur will handle that. If you're experiencing financial difficulties, I can offer an advance for the first 5 days, which will be your probationary period." "Thank you for your trust. I won't disappoint you. But may I—" Mandy began, but he gently cut her off. "How old are you?" 34, she answered, noticing his eyebrow rise in surprise. Mandy knew she appeared much younger than her age. "There's a car waiting downstairs," Mr. Falcon said, extending his hand. His handshake was warm and reassuring, both confident and kind. Mandy had never interacted with someone of such wealth and status before, having assumed such people were typically arrogant and cold. The driver, Steve, waited at the building's entrance. The 50-something man chatted with Mandy about her life, mentioning his decade-long service with the businessman's family. "Mr. Falcon seems like a very kind person," Mandy shared her impression of her new employer. Yes, he is, Steve chuckled. But wait until you meet his wife. As they drove into the suburbs, Mandy admired the beautiful houses with their wrought iron fences nestled among tall pine trees. They approached a gate that opened automatically, revealing a vast courtyard with manicured lawns and ornamental shrubs. In the distance stood a 2-story mansion that resembled a fairy tale castle. They were met on the doorstep by a pretty, full-figured woman in a kitchen apron who introduced herself as Tilda. Mandy thought she was Mr. Falcon's wife and asked her how her mother was feeling. Tilda looked at the newcomer in surprise and laughed. "No, I'm the housekeeper. Mrs. Falcon will come down later. Come on, I'll pour you some tea. Would you like some?" "I would," Mandy answered cheerfully, realizing that she liked it here very much. They entered the beautiful, spacious kitchen and were about to start the tea party when a disgruntled voice called out, "Where's the caregiver? Tilda, is the nurse here?" Tilda made a funny grimace and replied, "Here she is, Mrs. Falcon. Let's go." They went out into the hall, and Mandy saw the mistress of the house, a woman about her age, but very well groomed, tall, slender, with perfect tanned skin and long black hair that shone like in a shampoo commercial. It was obvious from her face and figure that she had undergone plastic surgery more than once, but the result was stunning. "Hello, my name is Mandy. Mr. Falcon said that you are looking for a caregiver for your mum." "Well, first of all, not my mum, my stepmother. Secondly, I'm the only one who decides whether you'll work here," the landlady replied haughtily. "Don't show up like that again. I can't stand jeans. And what's with the stretchy t-shirt? If you want to work in a decent house, dress properly." "All right, Mrs. Falcon," Mandy said, realizing that her image of the good rich people had shattered into pieces. "As for the stepmother, she lives in the right wing. That's where you'll be. I don't want you to appear in the left wing. No wandering around the house, no being late for work. She has a doctor there now. He will tell you what to do with her," the landlady explained on the way to the stepmother's rooms. She stopped abruptly and handed Mandy a few bills. "Paul said you need an advance for 5 days. Apparently there's nothing to eat. And look, don't spend it all on porridge. Buy yourself some proper clothes," Mrs. Falcon said with a sneer. Mandy took the money and lowered her eyes, realizing that she really needed this job now, so she would have to endure the rich woman's attacks. They entered the room to find an elderly lady sitting in an armchair, with a man in a white coat standing nearby, speaking reproachfully. "Mrs. Addison, how many times must I tell you that if you don't take these medications regularly, your condition will worsen?" "Really? What a surprise, and I was planning to climb Everest tomorrow," the woman replied sarcastically. "You're joking, but if we don't manage your blood pressure, Mr. Falcon will kill me," sighed the doctor. "Don't worry, he won't. Our dear mum will outlive everyone," Mrs. Falcon said angrily, leaving Mandy stunned. "Oh, Angela, my daughter, why did you come here? Were you hoping I was dead?" Mrs. Addison asked with a laugh. "For God's sake, live," Angela shrugged. "I brought you a present from Paul, a new caregiver hired by his favourite son-in-law. What's your name?" "Mandy," she whispered, bewildered by the scene. "That's it. I'm off, Doctor. Tell this one what she should do." The doctor explained to Mandy what medicines the woman should take and left. Mrs. Addison, looking at Mandy with a smirk, said, "You can take it easy. My son-in-law keeps trying to prolong my life, but I don't see the point in it." "Come on, you have to live," Mandy said. "What for? What do you live for?" the woman asked tiredly and looked at her companion carefully. Mrs. Addison's eyes were dull, like a faded photograph, colourless and sad. She had clearly been beautiful once. It showed in her facial features and well-preserved figure. "I live for my children. They are still small in kindergarten. Children are the meaning of my life," Mandy replied simply. "Children are good, but I don't have any of my own. At first I didn't want them. I was building my career, then I couldn't find the right father. And when both career and candidate finally aligned, I couldn't conceive any more. Age caught up with me. I raised Angela on my own, but somewhere along the way, I must have failed," said the woman with a sad smile. "My son isn't my biological child either. We adopted him, but I love him very much," shared Mandy. "How interesting. And why adopted? Is your daughter biological?" Mrs. Addison asked with interest. Mandy told her about her life, her childhood, her failed marriage, and her wonderful children. The older woman listened attentively, and for a moment there seemed to be a spark in her eyes. She agreed to take her medication and go for a walk in the yard. They talked for hours. Mrs. Addison had a wonderful sense of humour, and Mandy felt completely at ease with her. Several days passed in this way. During that time, Mandy never encountered the owners of the house again, always slipping quietly into the right wing to visit Mrs. Addison. She learned from the elderly woman's story that she had married Angela's father when she was 40. He was a partner of the company where she worked as an accountant. Their affair ended in a lavish wedding. She was his third wife. From his first marriage, her husband had a son, who now lives abroad and sometimes calls her. From his second marriage came Angela. Her mother was a young woman who married a wealthy man but failed to build a family. She ran away with a young lover, leaving her daughter with her father. Angela's mother spoiled her by periodically appearing in her life. She pretended that she missed her daughter terribly, but in fact she only came to ask Cameron for money. The girl was deeply connected to her mother. She always sensed in advance when she was coming. When I showed up at their house, Angela's mother was terribly angry. She probably planned to return to Cameron, certain that he couldn't resist her beauty. When she learned that her ex-husband had married a 40-year-old woman, she was furious. One day she demanded her daughter back and threatened that Cameron would never see the child again. He was worried, but I persuaded him to let his ex-wife take the girl, knowing it wouldn't last long. Sure enough, a week later, she called and said she had put Angela in a cab and that we should meet her and pay the fare. Cameron nearly lost his mind. A 10-year-old girl travelling alone with strangers. Fortunately, everything turned out all right. The child returned home safe and sound. We didn't see or hear from her mother again for 5 years. Then Cameron crashed his car. After 2 weeks in intensive care, we couldn't save him. I didn't want to live after that. For months, I was in a fog. That's when I lost Angela. Left to her own devices, she got involved with a bad crowd and fell in love with some scoundrel. I only snapped out of my grief when the authorities called to say my stepdaughter had been arrested for participating in a robbery. My attorneys got the case dropped. I began caring for her like a little girl, bringing her to and from school, speaking with her constantly, trying to involve her in her father's business. But she had entirely different interests. She didn't want to study. She just spent hours in front of the mirror dreaming about breast enlargement and nose jobs, always on some diet. Then, out of nowhere, her mother reappeared, having learned that Cameron was gone. She convinced Angela that all of her father's money should go to her, that she should claim the inheritance and live carefree with her mother. But I had inherited the whole business through my husband's will. I helped his eldest son, an intelligent, modest and kind man who had secured a good job abroad, married and had 3 children. I explained to Angela that I wouldn't let her destroy her father's business and squander all his money in a year. After that, everything became unstable. Angela would go to her mother, then return like a beaten dog, start drinking, always demanding money. Once, I was heading to negotiations and took her along to keep her from sneaking off to her mother or dubious friends. That's where she met Paul. She's pretty, and he liked her immediately. I watched in surprise as Angela changed. She became more settled, dated only him, and communicated normally with me. About a year later they married, and I handed over Cameron's business to my son-in-law, seeing what an honest and good man he was. I thought everything would be fine, but Angela hadn't really changed. She had just bided her time to catch a wealthy husband. I know what this troublesome girl is really doing while Paul's away. But that's life, Mandy. Mrs. Addison finished her story and fell silent, gazing into the distance. Yes, the rich also cry, Mandy thought. She had believed that wealthy people were immune to problems. Come now, Mandy, let's not be so gloomy. We've still got life to live, Mrs. Addison said cheerfully, and suggested they get something to eat. We're rebels. We can eat whenever we want, laughed the woman as they headed to the kitchen to find Tilda. On their way, they encountered Angela, wearing bright makeup and trailing expensive perfume. I told you to keep your caregiver out of this part of the house. What's so difficult to understand? She asked angrily. Angela, child, don't get angry or your Botox will shift to one side, Mrs. Addison said with feigned affection. The mistress shot a hateful glance at her stepmother and silently left the house. In the evening, as Mandy was leaving, after saying goodbye to the old woman, she ran into Angela. Are you going home already? She asked, surprisingly peaceful. Yes, it's time. I need to pick up the kids from kindergarten. Listen, what's your name? Oh, never mind. But could you please help me? The woman suddenly asked. Yes, of course, replied the bewildered Mandy. You see, my stepmother is getting worse every day. To make her comfortable, I want to put her in a fine boarding house nearby, but my husband thinks that would offend her. Thus, your job is to support me in this matter and help convince my husband that she is an old lady and needs constant professional medical care, so she belongs in a nursing home, Angela said. In a nursing home? But that's where people live out their lives, Mandy replied, discouraged by this suggestion. I understand. You're worried that you'll be out of work. Let's do this. I'll give you enough money to last you a year, the landlady said irritably. I don't know. Mrs. Addison is in her right mind. Why would she go there? I can't do that. Do you know why you have nothing? Because you're a stupid fool. Angela snapped and walked away. Mandy was troubled by this conversation all evening. She couldn't decide whether to tell Mrs. Addison about Angela's insidious plan or keep silent. In the morning, waking up with a heavy head, she discovered that her son complained about a headache. She called Mrs. Addison to ask about sick leave, and the woman immediately suggested Mandy to bring the children with her. An hour later, they arrived with the children, and Jeremy, upon seeing Mrs. Addison, immediately asked her where the slide or swing were. When told there weren't any, he wrinkled his nose and declared, "What's the point of such a big house if there isn't even a swing?" The woman laughed and promised to ask her son-in-law to fix this oversight. Little Molly asked the kind aunt's name and, after receiving permission to call her grandmother, pulled a doll from her backpack. "This is a present for you, Grandma, so you'll never be sad," she said, holding it out to Mrs. Addison. Delighted by the child's directness, the woman took the doll and, with tears in her eyes, replied that she would never be sad now that she had met such wonderful children. The day passed quickly. Mrs. Addison radiated happiness, surrounded by the cheerful children. Seeing her bright eyes, Mandy couldn't bring herself to mention yesterday's conversation with Angela. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Addison offered Mandy to take the children here again. The elderly woman's joy was evident. She seemed to have found a second youth, and Mandy agreed. The next day, arriving with the children, Mandy encountered Mr. Falcon. "Hello. Glad you brought the kids today. There's a surprise waiting inside. Sorry, but I must run," the businessman said mysteriously, ruffling Jeremy's hair before jumping into his car. The puzzled caregiver entered the house, where an excited Mrs. Addison awaited them. "Thank goodness you're all here. Let me check if the workers have finished, then I'll call you." They sat on the couch, waiting. Minutes later, she returned, flushed, excited,
wearing a warm smile. "Please, follow me," she announced ceremoniously. Outside, they discovered a large playground, complete with slides, a sandbox, swings, and a maze. The children squealed with delight and ran to play. "What a wonderful surprise!" Mandy gasped. "Paul and I spent yesterday choosing this play complex. We even arranged urgent delivery this morning," the elderly woman laughed. "All this for my children?" Mandy asked incredulously, trying to estimate the cost. "No, Mandy, it's not just for them. It's for me too. Your family has brought me more joy in these few days than I've known in years. This is the least I can do," Mrs. Addison replied. Meanwhile, Angela watched from the window as the children played and her stepmother smiled. The morning's arrival of workers installing playground equipment had surprised her, but learning it was for the caregiver's children had left her stunned. Seeing her stepmother's attachment to this servants and her brood, she frantically plotted her removal. The scheme came from Gary, her fitness trainer and secret lover. Thinking of him made Angela tremble. He was devastatingly handsome, and in his arms she lost all control, something no other man had achieved. His plan was simple. Everyone has their price. They would plant a wad full of money in the stepmother's room, install cameras, and wait for the good-for-nothing beggar to take the bait. Initially, the nurse didn't cause Angela any negative feelings. She was focused on morally crushing her stepmother, who had supposedly ruined her fate by taking all her father's money. But when Angela noticed how Mrs. Addison was drawn to Mandy and her children, she realized that removing them from her stepmother's life would help break her down and force her into a nursing home. For years, Angela had yearned for the freedom that her father's mother could provide, but her stepmother had insisted she study and find her vocation. Then came naive, wealthy Paul, who proved easy to win over. Life with him turned out dull. He refused to buy expensive cars, wouldn't let her vacation alone, and constantly talked about giving birth to children. However, throughout their marriage, Angela took countless birth control pills, refusing to become a mother. After an hour of active play at the playground, Mandy and Mrs. Addison finally gathered the happy children into the house for a meal. The women left them in Mrs. Addison's sitting room and went to help Tilda to set the table. The housekeeper was delighted by Mrs. Addison's improved mood. The new caregiver and her energetic children had made her more cheerful and seemingly younger. Meanwhile, the children spotted a purse on the table and decided to buy sweets at the next store. Jeremy told his younger sister everyone would be happy to see the treats they brought. However, the guard at the gate stopped them from leaving and sent them back. The disappointed children returned to find their worried mother and Mrs. Addison searching for them, and they surrendered the purse. At this very time, Angela came down from the second floor, anticipating the next phase of her scheme. She, of course, did not expect that the money would be taken by children and the guards would be so vigilant, but she had already thought of a way to make a scandal out of it. "Wonderful! Now we're being robbed in our own house," the landlady announced loudly. "Mrs. Falcon, there must be some misunderstanding," Mandy said, flustered. "You're laid off. Don't expect payment. Of course you planned this, bringing your gang of children here to steal from us," Angela said triumphantly. "Stop this nonsense," Mrs. Addison snapped, and narrowing her eyes asked, "Why was your purse in my room?" "This is all my house. I can leave my things wherever I want. I didn't realize your dear caregiver had trained her children to steal," the stepdaughter insisted. "My children aren't thieves. I didn't teach them such things. They will be punished for taking something without permission," Mandy cried. "Take your brood and get out," Angela commanded, pointing to the door while savouring her stepmother's pallor. Just then, Paul entered, reviewing some papers. "What's happening here?" he asked, taking in the crying caregiver. his furious wife, and his mother-in-law clutching the children. "Look at this, Paul. Security footage," Angela said, showing him the video on her phone. "Good thing the guards stopped them. Ruined this con artist's clever money-making scheme." "Children, why did you take the money?" Paul asked, sitting beside the tearful kids. "We wanted to buy candy for everyone," Jeremy answered, wiping his tears. "Don't do that again. Taking others' things without asking isn't right. Now, come, have lunch together. Did you try new slides?" The owner led the children to the dining room, leaving his stunned wife behind. "Paul, wait! Their mother taught them to steal from us. I've noticed things missing for days, so I installed a camera and caught them," Angela said, rushing after them and refusing to give up. "Angela, please stop inventing stories," her husband said with a sad smile. "Well, my dear, now you see why I always told you to study and read books. The theft scheme might be clever, but the execution is sloppy as usual," Mrs. Addison remarked, following the fuming mistress. Angela, pale with rage, spun around and confronted the distressed Mandy. "If you think this senile old woman is your ticket to a better life, you're wrong. You should have agreed to help me. Now you'll be thrown out like garbage, you worthless beggar." Mandy, bewildered by this sudden hostility, considered looking for new work, but seeing Mrs. Addison and Mr. Falcon cheerfully offering pancakes for the children helped ease her mind. "Mandy, join us for lunch," the owner called to her. After lunch, Mandy was putting them to bed in Mrs. Addison's room when suddenly Paul entered. "You'll have to excuse my wife. She can be simply unbearable sometimes. Every day, I don't know what awaits me at home, tragedy or comedy." The man smiled. "I so enjoyed talking to your little ones, and my mother-in-law is happy in their company. Thank you for being in our home. Don't pay any attention to Angela, and if she causes any more trouble, come to me." Mandy wanted to tell him about the conversation with the landlady, but she couldn't muster the courage. Paul sat down on the sofa near the sleeping children and said sadly, "I have dreamed of children for so many years, but we never succeeded. And now I don't know if I want Angela to become a mother. You are happy. You have wonderful kids, someone to wake up for every day, to go on, to plan the future. I'm frozen in one moment. Everything is the same. Negotiations, deals. We live for more and more money. But who's the money for? I'd give up everything, but so many people depend on me now. You know, when my mother-in-law called me at 9:30 at night to choose these slides, I was stunned at first. And then we got so carried away. It was like something new. I wish I could have seen the kids' reaction. I felt like spring had come to our house and everything has come alive." Mandy looked at this big grown man and wanted to hug him. She decided not to tell him about Angela's proposal to avoid upsetting him more. Paul stood up, looked into her eyes, and inexplicably took her hand. She held her breath. It seemed he was about to kiss her. The anticipation made her insides tighten, and she stepped forward pliantly. "What are you doing here?" Angela's loud exclamation brought them back to reality. Paul let go of Mandy's hand and silently left the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the mistress hissed angrily to Mandy and ran after her husband. The next day, Mandy arrived alone, determined to invite Mrs. Addison to visit them and walk around the city. Entering the house, she met Angela coming down the stairs. "Hey, you don't have to come here anymore. Your ward is gone," laughed the hostess. "She just left." "What do you mean? Gone? What happened?" Mandy's legs weakened at the news. "She went to live somewhere else. Too bad it's not in a cemetery. Don't come here again," the landlady said rudely. "And for trying to seduce my husband, you won't get paid for your work.
You and your misbehaving brats have already eaten up 2 of your salaries." Mandy left the house, confused about what to do next and where to find Mrs. Addison. She didn't have Mr. Falcon's phone number, but remembering she had written down his secretary's number before the interview, she called and learned that the businessman had gone abroad on a business trip and wouldn't return for at least a week. When Mandy approached the driver, Steve, she asked where Mrs. Addison might have been taken, and he promised to get information from Angela's personal driver. The next day he called with the address of the nursing home where Mrs. Addison had been taken. Mandy went there immediately and, after speaking with the doctor, received permission to visit. When she entered the room, she saw a woman sitting by the window and called out softly. The woman turned, and a familiar light shone in her faded eyes. "Mandy, how did you find me?" she asked shyly, trying to conceal her joy. "Enough resting here. I need your help. I've been offered a job, and I have no one to leave my children with," Mandy said cheerfully, beginning to gather Mrs. Addison's things. They walked out into the street, leaving behind a grey building that smelled of the oppressive calm of fading lives. The children greeted Mrs. Addison with joy, but Mandy's mother, who was looking after her grandchildren, pressed her lips together unhappily when she saw how reverently her daughter spoke to this stranger. Several days passed. Mandy rushed to her new work, while Mrs. Addison got sleepy Jeremy and Molly ready for kindergarten. How strange it is to feel part of a family of complete strangers, she thought involuntarily. When Paul returned from his business trip, he got into his car, hoping to see Mandy and her children. He had been thinking about her all week, catching himself imagining how different his life could be with someone like her. In the trunk were packages, a large transformer robot for Jeremy and a talking doll for Molly. He frowned, anticipating the conversation with his wife. The decision was clear. He needed to divorce Angela, while providing for her needs. Love had long since vanished. Her feisty character and arrogance towards others had become unbearable. The final straw was finding the pill box she had carelessly left in the bathroom. When Paul asked her about the medication and learned they were birth control pills, everything became clear. He decided to leave her the city apartment and her late father's business. Remembering the half-empty apartment needed furnishing, Paul instructed the driver to head into town to check it first. Upon reaching his floor, he opened the door and heard a woman's laughter. Bewildered, he walked toward the bedroom and found his wife with another man. Angela, upon seeing her husband in the doorway, nearly fainted with fear, her mind racing. Her lover tried hiding under the blanket, screaming hysterically. "Well, well," Paul muttered, turning toward the exit, surprised by his own composure. He felt relieved. Now he wouldn't need to explain himself to his wife. "Why are you lying there, you fool? Go after him!" Angela struck Gary sharply. "Why?" squeaked the frightened man. "We need to end this once and for all," she declared, leaping from the bed. "Are you insane? He'll kill us both," Gary whimpered. "Get it together, you coward. Stop whining. We must stop him, or we'll lose everything," Angela snapped, hastily dressing. "Hit him hard on the head, and we'll figure out the rest later." "With what? No, I can't do this," sobbed the lover, frantically dressing while planning his escape, terrified that her husband might be waiting outside. "He must have gone for a gun," the fitness trainer thought suddenly, dissolving into tears over his unfortunate choice in mistresses. After all, their sports centre had other wealthy clients, older and less beautiful, perhaps, but with far less dangerous husbands. Angela glared at the sobbing Gary, fighting an urge to throw a vase at him. Realizing this beautiful coward would never do a dirty job for her, she decided to call her husband and attempt reconciliation. Paul answered immediately, his voice steady. "Angela, You'll keep the apartment and receive a fair settlement. This is goodbye. The driver will deliver your belongings this evening."
"Paul, what are you saying? Let me explain. You've misunderstood everything," she stammered.
"Don't call again. Goodbye," he replied and hung up. Furious, she tried calling back, but found herself blocked. "Fine. We'll see how you miss me in a few days," Angela thought, studying herself in the mirror. At home, Paul learned from Tilda that Angela had placed Mrs. Addison in a nursing home, but Mandy had taken her in. After getting the address, he went to her home, where her mother-in-law answered the door. "Please, no questions yet," the man smiled. Mandy hurried home after shopping. When she opened the door, she found what seemed like a dream standing there. Surprised, she dropped her groceries, and Paul, noticing eggs leaking from the bag, said with mock disappointment, "Well, what are we going to have for dinner now? Let's go to my place. I should have eggs in the fridge." He embraced Mandy and kissed her. She kissed him back. They stood in the doorway, lost in their kiss, until Molly's voice broke in. "What are you doing here?" "We're cleaning," her mother answered, grabbing the wet bag in confusion. "Is this how Uncle Paul helps you clean?" the puzzled little girl persisted, making the adults laugh. A year later, Paul and Mrs. Addison were chasing after Jeremy and Molly, who refused to pose for the photographer in the maternity ward, while the newborn boy awoke in his mother's arms, demanding attention with loud cries. Eva ran out of the apartment in a hurry. She had overslept and was late for work. It was good that Ted was so thoughtful. While his beloved was panicking, looking for her things and tidying herself up after a nap, he made her coffee and a hot sandwich with cheese, ham and tomato, the way she liked it. Eva took a bite on the run. There was an important meeting today and she couldn't be late. She kissed Ted goodbye, as always. He gently put his arm around her waist, looking into her eyes with that goosebump-inducing gaze of his. He wished her a good day. He had to go to work later, so he wasn't in any hurry. Eva smiled at her lover and slipped out of the apartment. Ted had once been her salvation, her comfort, and still was. Always cheering her up, supporting her, finding the right and important words. With him, Eva felt easy and calm. She almost forgot to think about Cooper. He now had his own life. Their paths had diverged. Eva quickly ran down the stairs, not waiting for the elevator. It was always busy at this time of day in the apartment building, with so many neighbours. Walking would be faster. But in the parking lot behind the apartment building, Eva suddenly realised she had mixed up the day. The important meeting wasn't today, but tomorrow. She stopped, struck by this thought like a thunderbolt. That's right. It had been rescheduled. That's why she'd set her alarm for later. She hadn't overslept after all. Eva kicked a pebble in front of her, as if it were to blame. Glancing at her watch, the woman realised she still had plenty of time to return home. She could have a quiet coffee with Ted and talk about his treatment. Though Ted didn't like to discuss the subject, often trying to change the conversation topic, it was important to Eva to know what awaited them. He was her closest person, and everything that happened to him affected her directly. Fortunately, his condition seemed to be improving. Ted's treatment had required significant money. Some he found on his own, and Eva offered the rest from the bottom of her heart. She would have done even more to help him. Ted accepted gratefully, promising to repay everything once he recovered. He never detailed his diagnosis, only mentioning it was a genetic heart condition. The treatment was effective, but expensive. Thankfully, Eva stepped in to help. She had money, a decent amount in her bank account. Eva earned well as a lawyer in an oil company. Her father had secured her the position right after university.
She couldn't have gotten such a coveted role without experience and connections. But Eva had proven herself, working hard and learning quickly, never shying away from any task. She'd earned her reputation as a conscientious specialist, what led her to subsequent promotion. Yes, Eva had everything she needed for a prosperous life. First, a loving family, her parents with whom she maintained warm, friendly relations. Eva knew they would never leave her in trouble, and this security gave her confidence and strength for further achievements. Second, after university, her father had given his only daughter an apartment in a prestigious area of the city. But at first, Eva hadn't rushed to move in, preferring to live with her parents for now. She disliked being alone. Initially, her father's gift of a beautiful, stylishly furnished apartment had delighted her. She'd even jumped for joy when he handed her the keys. But later, that apartment played an unpleasant role in her life, something Eva preferred not to remember. Now she and Ted shared a rented apartment. They split the payment and household expenses. Well, almost split them. Truth be told, Eva contributed more, but that's just how things worked out. She had a good job with stable income, while Ted worked in construction, his earnings fluctuating with the number and size of projects. Eva feared most repeating what happened with Cooper. She didn't want to lose Ted the same way. That's why she tried not to emphasize financial matters. Ted had a simpler attitude toward everything. Easygoing was probably the best way to describe his personality, and Eva loved that about him. Eva called the elevator and pressed the button, anticipating a quick meeting with her beloved. Ted would definitely be happy to see her. His eyes always lit up with a special fire when they met. The elevator stopped too quickly. The doors slid apart, revealing a bold number 5 painted on the wall. Eva was on the 5th floor, while her apartment was on the 8th. The woman decisively stepped out. She wouldn't continue by elevator. Walking would be better. The elevator in their building had been problematic lately, either getting stuck between floors or, like now, stopping on the wrong floor. Taking the stairs was safer and healthier. As Eva started climbing, she suddenly heard Ted's voice. He was talking to someone on the landing, presumably on the phone since there was no other voice. Eva decided to surprise her lover by sneaking up and jumping out onto the landing. Ted loved such pranks. But then Eva heard something that made her stop and listen. Ted said something that couldn't be ignored. Eva froze. She found herself hanging on every word her lover spoke. The meaning was difficult to grasp since she couldn't hear the other person, but that unknown participant seemed to be trying to dissuade Ted from some plan. Ted argued, resisted and proved his point, revealing new facts that made Eva's blood run cold. It felt like a dream, too surreal to be true. Yet there was no denying what was happening. There he was, standing on the landing, saying these terrible things. When the conversation ended, Ted slammed the door and disappeared into their apartment. Eva couldn't go home. Not now. She needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto a step, not caring about her light-coloured dress pants. She remembered meeting Ted at a local rock bar, where her friends had taken her to lift her spirits after Cooper. Cooper. Eva had thought their feelings were real, sincere, strong and deep. Everything pointed to it. Though they'd known each other since high school, their romance began in their 3rd year of university. Eva studied at a prestigious law faculty, while Cooper pursued engineering. He'd always excelled in mathematics and had a passion for physics. To Eva, these subjects were like hieroglyphics. Cooper had helped her countless times with tests and homework. She'd always thought him nice, if somewhat shy and modest. Then one day, Eva learned Cooper had long harboured feelings for her but never dared express them. This revelation surprised Eva. She'd never noticed. His confession touched her heart. Warmth washed over Eva, making her dizzy as she smiled. She loved everything he said and the way he looked at her. His gaze was full of love, admiration and devotion. When they started dating, everything seemed perfect. Eva discovered new sides to Cooper and fell deeper in love. He was reliable, caring, loving, sensitive, and capable. Raised by a single mother, he'd shouldered adult responsibilities from an early age. This had shaped him into a mature, intelligent, and kind man. Eva often witnessed his helpfulness. He'd assist others unprompted, seeing needs and meeting them naturally. He was simply who he was. Whether pushing a stranger's stalled car or helping with heavy bags, he did it all effortlessly and without waiting for reciprocation. Cooper treated Eva with tender care, always anticipating her needs. He frequently expressed his love. Their relationship seemed perfect, except for one thing. It didn't happen immediately. The changes crept in gradually. At first, Eva tried to ignore it, but as time passed it became increasingly difficult. The root of it all lay in their vastly different financial situations. Eva came from a wealthy family. Right after graduation, she landed a job with an excellent salary and owned both an apartment and a beautiful car, all gifts from her parents. At her age, she couldn't have earned these things herself. Cooper's life was different. He grew up without a father, his mother working as a cleaner from dawn until night. She cleaned multiple buildings to support her children. As the oldest, with 3 younger sisters, Cooper became their caretaker during his teenage years. He started working at 13, taking whatever jobs he could find, washing cars, unloading trucks, anything to help his mother. During university, he secured an internship at a design bureau in his field. After graduating, he became a full-time employee, but wasn't satisfied with his salary. Entry-level positions rarely paid well, unless you had connections, like Eva did. Cooper couldn't provide Eva with the lifestyle she was accustomed to, and this weighed heavily on him. But Eva didn't care about clubs, restaurants, or expensive things. She understood what mattered most: being with someone understanding and supportive, someone who made her feel peaceful and safe. That's what Cooper gave her. Eva wanted to show Cooper the world. He'd never travelled anywhere. Though she could easily afford trips for both of them, he declined every offer, even as a birthday present. "Eva, I'm already struggling with that income difference. Are you trying to crush me completely?" Cooper would ask bitterly, clearly uncomfortable. Eva tried to ease the tension, but her attempts only made things worse. Cooper's enjoyment of life was hampered by what Eva saw as an outdated belief: that a man must be the provider, no exceptions. Cooper worked hard, climbing the career ladder, but in his mind, his growing income was never enough. However, despite this one source of tension, they were happy together. They met almost every evening, taking walks, sharing their days and laughing together. Cooper gradually became Eva's whole world. She even stopped meeting her friends, as none of them understood her the way he did. Their connection felt incredible. Later, Eva would regret starting that particular conversation, knowing how sensitive such topics were. That evening in the park, Cooper was sharing news about a job offer, a lower position at another company, but with better pay and prospects. He was hesitant to leave his current project unfinished. Eva listened, supportive, assuring him she'd back any decision he made. But her mind was elsewhere, preparing to make an important proposal she had been considering for a while. She wanted to live with Cooper, to share their daily lives, to care for each other. They'd been dating for a long time, both adults, yet still living with their families, dating like teenagers, really. Eva felt it was time to make a more mature step. "Cooper, how do you feel about living together?" she finally asked. She knew such proposals typically came from men, but Cooper was focused on his career and business plans. His mind seemed occupied with those serious matters rather than living arrangements. "I really want this," she added. Cooper stopped walking and gently took her face in his palms, a tender gesture she loved. "That's wonderful. I think about it too, how good it would be to live together. But now isn't the right time. I'm working on building a solid financial foundation for our future family, but I'm not ready yet. And it's difficult for me to say this, but Cooper, I want to be with you all the time. We're still dating like school children, returning to our parents' house at night." "But we're adults. I want more. I can't rent an apartment right now." Cooper lowered his eyes. Again he felt ashamed that he couldn't provide a dignified existence for himself and his beloved. "You know, I'm saving every penny for my business now. I have an idea. If it works out, the profits will be more than decent, and everything will be fine." "I don't want to be happy in some mythical future." Eva pulled away from Cooper, anger rising within her. She had thought her lover would support her idea. "Why complicate everything by renting an apartment? I have one. Beautiful, large, spacious. Just imagine how happy we'll be there." "Your apartment, your car, your money," Cooper said, his temper flaring. Eva realized she had hit his sore spot again, but the words couldn't be taken back. "You're constantly reminding me who I am, making me feel unworthy of you." "That's not true. I love you, you know that. I just don't understand why we can't live together in my apartment now. What's the big deal?" "I don't want to feel like a freeloader, living off a girl who's in love with me. Is that so challenging to understand?" "I'm sick of you." Eva was amazed at herself. Her frustration with Cooper's principles had been building up and finally erupted. "I don't care about your money. It doesn't matter at all." "It does matter." Cooper shook his head, his eyes filled with pain and sadness. "You know how hard it is for me to overcome this financial barrier between us." "There is no barrier," Eva shouted. "You've built these walls in your head, and you don't even realize they're meaningless." "It is important. A man has to be a provider, has to provide for his family." "No, those are outdated stereotypes." "No." Cooper shook his head. Eva was furious with him. She wanted to shake these antiquated ideas about gender roles out of his head. They were doing so well. They loved each other, understood each other, supported each other. Eva knew such relationships were rare, and now Cooper was destroying everything because of his outdated beliefs. "Eva," Cooper looked into her eyes, "I realized long ago that I'm not worthy of you." "What nonsense! What are you doing?" Eva blinked in confusion, suddenly understanding this was serious. This wasn't their usual quarrel that would blow over. This was different. "I don't want to spoil your life. You deserve more. I don't know how my attempts to achieve something will end, and you need to live now." "Cooper!" Eva exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Are you leaving me?" "I'm just stepping aside," he said, lowering his eyes, "so you can find someone better." Eva was overwhelmed by emotion, her vision blurring. Cooper had said something unthinkable. He was leaving her. All she'd wanted was to live together, to feel like family. He must have lied about everything, she thought. Maybe he'd never truly loved me, and this financial difference was just an excuse to leave, because he was tired of me. Eva felt the blood drain from her face, and Cooper's expression turned to concern. "What's wrong? Are you ill?" "You lied about your feelings. Pretended," Eva managed to say, fighting back tears. "When I suggested living together, you got scared of commitment and decided to break things off." "You're wrong. Shut up! You're nothing but a cheater and a traitor. I never want to see or hear from you again." "I love you. That's why I'm stepping aside.
Believe me, it's for your own good. I'm failing. I'm a loser." "Stop lying. You've been lying all along. You wanted an easy relationship, and as soon as it got serious, you decided to run." Eva could see her words were hurting Cooper. He tried to explain himself, but she wouldn't listen. She hurled accusations without recognizing herself. If she were Cooper, she would have left such a hysterical woman long ago. But he stayed, trying to calm her, as if he cared. Not that it mattered. He was still leaving her, for her own good. It ended with Cooper holding Eva tightly until she calmed down. Then he apologized and called her a cab. That was it. Over between them, just like that. Strange and unexpected, at least for Eva. Cooper, it seemed, had been contemplating this breakup for a while. Eva missed Cooper physically. His smell, his touch, his voice. It was fortunate she was on vacation. She simply couldn't work in such a state. She lay in her room all day, eating occasionally at her mother's insistence, not even turning on the TV or picking up a book. Everything had suddenly ceased to interest her. Cooper had said it would hurt them both, yet he remained absolutely certain of his decision. He sincerely believed Eva would be better off without him. It was all because of his attitudes, outdated, irrational, utterly stupid. Or perhaps he hadn't loved her that deeply. Who had she been to him? Before, Eva thought Cooper considered her his closest and dearest person. Now she wasn't sure at all. Most likely, she had invented an ideal person, an ideal relationship, overwhelming him with her love and care. So, he'd crafted an excuse to leave. "I'm complex. I'm not worthy of you." Eva's girlfriends came to visit, the very ones she'd neglected for Cooper's sake. They proved to be truly close friends, supporting, encouraging, and trying to distract her. "Good riddance," Angela assured her. "He truly isn't worthy of you. He knows he's a loser compared to you." "You'll find 1,000,000 better men than Cooper," Alex chimed in. Eva remained silent, not arguing. She knew there wouldn't be 1,000,000 Coopers. There was only one. Eventually her friends managed to drag her to a bar, despite her initial protests. By then, she had somewhat recovered from the shock of the breakup. She had to come to terms with the fact that she and Cooper had no future. It was difficult, but time heals, and her girlfriends tried their best, something Eva deeply appreciated. Through mutual acquaintances, she learned that Cooper had thrown himself into work. He was at a new company building a business. He had become withdrawn, wasn't socializing, and hadn't started dating anyone new. Strangely, this pleased Eva. It would have been harder if he'd left her for someone else. That evening, at the bar, was lively and crowded. The friends first listened to the local rock band in the main hall, before moving to the karaoke room. The atmosphere felt like a house party. People lounged on soft armchairs and comfortable puffs, enjoying themselves, chatting and singing along with those at the microphone. Strangers chatted like old friends. It had always been like this here, the reason her friends loved this rock bar. Eva nestled in the corner of the room, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Her friends had stepped out to the smoking room for a while. Eva stayed behind. She only smoked when drinking, and tonight she was driving. She felt surprisingly good. The soul pain ache had subsided somewhat, and she even felt like dancing. She thought about suggesting her friends head to a club later. That's when Ted stepped up to the microphone. Though Eva didn't know his name yet. He had bright eyes and a charming smile. His grey fitted t-shirt, faded jeans and sneakers suited him perfectly. Then Ted began to sing. It was a song about an unreachable beauty who had captured a rocker's heart. His voice was strong and pleasant, though his pitch was completely off. Despite his poor pitch, people loved his performance. They sang along and clapped. Ted kept catching Eva's eyes.
she realized he was singing just for her, dedicating the most heartfelt lines to her alone. There was no mistaking it. As the song ended, he approached the stunned Eva and gracefully knelt before her like a knight. It was beautiful and elegant. People watched with interest. Eva felt their gazes and grew shy, but the young man seemed completely at ease. When the music stopped, he handed off the microphone and settled onto the beanbag chair beside Eva without asking. She didn't mind. Something about this young man intrigued her. "Hello, beauty with the sad eyes." He smiled charmingly. "I'm Ted. And what's your name, beautiful stranger?" Eva looked into his sparkling dark eyes and sensed something new beginning in her life. For the first time since breaking up with Cooper, she felt beautiful again, and she savoured that feeling. So they began dating. Ted radiated positive energy, a true life of the party, who told entertaining stories about himself and his friends. The sociable guy knew everyone. People constantly greeted him or stopped to chat wherever he and Eva went. Soon Ted suggested they live together. He took the initiative himself. Eva was glad. She loved the atmosphere he created around him. With him, she forgot all her problems, never dwelled on negative thoughts, and simply enjoyed life. Ted knew how to have fun, and his mood was contagious. Remembering Cooper's reaction, Eva didn't tell Ted that she had an apartment. They decided to rent a place instead. Since both were working, they could afford it. Ted had a simpler outlook on life. He wasn't bothered that Eva drove a beautiful car while he couldn't afford such transportation. In fact, he often asked to drive her car. He would put on an exaggerated air of importance that Eva found hilarious, blast the music, and speed down the highway with the gas pedal pressed to the floor. Eva felt completely happy. She had everything, including a cheerful, laid-back boyfriend who loved her. At least, that's what he frequently told her. Ted was quite different from Cooper. Though less reliable and nurturing, he had an easygoing personality and knew how to enjoy life. He was never dull, which Eva appreciated. Yet she probably wasn't in love with Ted the way she had been with Cooper. Ted became her lifeline, a salvation she clung to. Occasionally, Eva would hear about Cooper through mutual friends, and her heart would still ache at the mention of his name. She realized her feelings for him hadn't completely cooled. It was an odd, uncomfortable sensation, but Eva hoped it would fade with time. Ted lived in the moment, rarely thinking about or planning for the future. He was content with his unstable, modest-paying job. He loved bars, clubs, and parties, and drew Eva into that lifestyle. While she enjoyed having fun, she sometimes found it exhausting. Nevertheless, everything in Eva's life seemed perfect, almost cloudless, until Ted's illness struck suddenly. The once energetic young man began feeling unwell, tiring quickly, experiencing swelling and dizziness. Eva insisted he get examined. The doctor's verdict was devastating. Ted was diagnosed with a serious illness. Eva couldn't believe it. The image of playful Ted seemed incompatible with any disease. But without treatment, the prognosis was grim. Ted started taking his health seriously, visiting doctors regularly. Treatment was available but expensive. The free healthcare option meant a long wait, during which Ted's condition could worsen significantly. Eva offered him the money herself. Though initially reluctant, he eventually accepted with gratitude and promised to repay her. He looked uncharacteristically serious at that moment. Without hesitation, Eva withdrew her savings of several years. It was a substantial amount, enough to buy a new mid-range car. "I appreciate this so much," Ted said sincerely, holding the money. "Now I'll do everything for you." "First, beat this disease," Eva said with encouraging smile. Ted started treatment. He received infusions and expensive medications. The results came quickly. He soon regained his former energy and enthusiasm. Eva was overjoyed. His recovery progressed well once he had begun proper treatment. Though he couldn't work as before, and Eva became the main provider for their small family, this didn't bother her at all. Ted seemed unbothered too, which pleased Eva. She remembered how Cooper had struggled when he appeared less financially secure than his partner. That had ultimately ended their relationship. Ted, however, didn't care about such matters. He focused on what he considered important: their relationship, mutual care, love, and maintaining his cheerful nature. And until recently, Eva thought she knew Ted completely. He had never hidden anything from her, even truths that showed him in an unfavourable light. Ted had always been honest about his mistakes. It was endearing, really. He lowered his head, spoke softly, smiled sheepishly. But an overheard conversation in the stairwell changed everything. Eva realised she had lived for almost a year under the same roof with a stranger. A real monster. A skilled manipulator. And an Oscar-worthy actor. Ted had only pretended to be a simple, honest, straightforward guy. In reality, he was a terrible man, with hidden, ugly depths. That vile creature will get what she deserves. She'll shower in her tears. These words from Ted made Eva freeze on the landing below. He had never spoken so aggressively before. His tone was entirely different, filled with anger, irritation, even hatred. Eva pressed against the wall, close enough to hear every word clearly. She has no idea who she's dealing with. Ted continued speaking to someone on the phone. I've thought it all through. 2 birds with 1 stone. Even 3. Of course I'm sure. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'll get revenge on that witch for humiliating me, plus make some money. She owes me for everything. Eva struggled to make sense of it all. Something sinister was clearly brewing. But what? Who was Ted planning to hurt? And how? Eva listened more intently, determined to understand. What can she possibly do? I'm his father. That fool put me on the birth certificate herself, trying to trap me with her and her brat. Well, let her deal with it now. Ted laughed, harsh and cold. What consequences? Please. I'll frighten her so badly she won't dare go to the police. I'll have her precious little brat in my hands. I'll take the kid away. The possibilities are endless, you know. Eva's breath caught. The meaning was clear. Ted was planning to kidnap a child, his own son, according to the birth certificate. A chill ran down Eva's spine. This was monstrous. She had to learn more to prevent this atrocity. I've got money, Ted continued, his voice calmer now. Eva gave me some for my supposed treatment. She's such a fool, believes everything I tell her. All I need is a car, something unremarkable. I'm counting on your help. Don't try to talk me out of it. My mind's made up. I need the money, understand? I want to leave, go somewhere by the sea, settle down, start fresh, maybe open my own bar. Always dreamed of that. Hazel deserves what's coming. She has debts to pay. Time to settle up. Hazel. This name Eva had heard from Ted before by chance. That evening, Eva was taking the bus home, since her car was being repaired. It was late, the neighbourhood rough, darkness everywhere. Eva hurried toward home, alert to every strange sound. Her new sandals were rubbing her heel raw. Despite the excitement and desire to get to her cosy room as soon as possible, the girl sat down at the entrance of one of the neighbouring houses. With relief, she removed the painful sandals, letting the cool evening air soothe her blistered heel. Suddenly, she heard Ted's voice and felt a surge of joy. How wonderful that he'd finished work, that they'd met by chance. Now they could walk home together. She wouldn't feel scared any more. He might even carry her. Eva was almost certain he would. Ted had regained his strength, returned to his old self. She wouldn't even need to ask. One mention of her sore heel, and he'd offer to help. He always took such gentle care of her. Meanwhile, Ted was buzzing one of the intercoms in the building's entrance. Eva assumed he must have friends living there. She was about to call out when someone answered the intercom, a woman's voice trembling with fear or rage. "Get out before I call the police!" "You know what I want, Hazel," Ted snapped. "You know what to do to make me leave you alone." Eva felt jealousy flare in her heart, pure jealousy. The thought of her boyfriend speaking so intimately with another woman unsettled her. They seemed like former lovers, mid-quarrel. Eva concluded this must be an ex-girlfriend, and clearly their feelings hadn't fully cooled. "Go to hell!" The woman cut off the intercom. Ted cursed viciously and slammed his fist against the door. As he turned to leave, he spotted Eva on the bench. "Baby, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice completely transformed. Before her sat the Ted she thought she knew, tender, kind, good. Eva mentioned her blister, and, as expected, he scooped her up and carried her home. Of course, Eva asked questions. She did not hide the fact that she had heard Ted talking to the owner of the rare name Hazel. "It's a girl I used to date," Ted explained reluctantly. "We broke up terribly. She is a dishonest person. Hazel owes me money, a large sum. She cheated me once. I wouldn't give a damn about the money to avoid dealing with her, but I'm in a situation, you see, with this disease. Treatment requires money. I can't work properly now, so I'm trying to get her to pay me back." "Don't go to her any more," Eva pleaded. "If you need money, I'll get it. But don't contact her, please." "You've helped me a lot already." Ted shook his head. "If it hadn't been for you, who knows what would have happened to me now." And now, in this conversation on the landing between floors, Ted mentioned Hazel again. As Eva listened to Ted, the situation became clearer. Ted and Hazel had a son together, and Ted was listed as the father on the boy's birth certificate. Hazel refused to let Ted see the child, though Ted himself showed little interest in the boy, caring only about money, and he had found a way to get what he wanted. Ted planned something terrible to take the child away. Hazel, as Eva realized, was wealthy and could give Ted anything he demanded for her son's sake. Ted's interlocutor, whom Eva couldn't hear, was clearly trying to dissuade him. Ted kept making arguments to support his decision. "The police won't do anything to me. According to all the documents, I'm the father of this baby. She thought to tie me to her that way, and now she regrets it, but it's too late. A father has the right to take his child at any time. It won't even be considered kidnapping." He had thought of everything. Cunning, calculating, unscrupulous. And Eva had trusted him, just as Hazel once did. After finishing his terrible conversation and his cigarette, Ted went back to the apartment. Eva didn't go upstairs. Instead, she sank on the cold step, wondering what to do. Ted was clearly a monster. He had planned a terrible crime, and Eva knew she had to prevent this tragedy. She needed to warn Hazel. Fortunately, Eva knew which building and entrance the woman lived in. She called her boss claiming illness and was given the day off. Perfect. Now, she had time to help Hazel. Hazel was likely unaware of the danger looming over her. Eva went directly to her building and called the first apartment she could and asked for Hazel. "She lives in 153, the elderly woman replied, and hung up. With trembling fingers, Eva dialed 153 on the intercom. She expected no answer, assuming Hazel would be at work, but after 2 rings, a woman's voice responded. "7th floor, come in." Hazel was clearly expecting someone, probably a delivery. Eva entered and took the elevator up. The door to apartment 153 stood ajar. Hazel waited in the doorway. "Oh, you're not the pizza delivery?" she asked, puzzled. She was tall, beautiful, 10 years Eva's senior, and impeccably groomed and stylish. "I'm sorry, I thought it was the delivery." "Mum, is the pizza here?" A 4-year-old boy appeared at the doorstep. Ted's son. The resemblance was striking, and not just in appearance. "Peter, no, go to your room," Hazel told her son. He obeyed immediately. "And you're here about?" she asked, looking at Eva questioningly. Eva took a deep breath. She hadn't planned how to begin this conversation. "It's a very long and difficult story," she said finally. "First, I must warn you, you and your child are in danger." Fear flashed across Hazel's face, but she quickly composed herself. "Ted," she said, and Eva nodded. Hazel led Eva to the kitchen. The apartment was stylish, clearly showing its owner's wealth. No wonder Ted hoped to profit from her. Eva told everything she had heard by chance on the playground. Hazel listened without interrupting, her face taking on an increasingly puzzled expression. "He'll do it," she said when Eva had finished. "He's a frightening man. He will stop at nothing." "But you know everything now. We have to do something to stop him. Maybe he'll go away somewhere." "That won't help. I already ran away from him once in this town. I bought an apartment here. I thought it was all in the past. But Ted found me, rented an apartment nearby. He started threatening me, and now he wants to take our son. It's horrible." "Isn't there anything you can do? You need a lawyer." "I guess there is," Hazel said, a little calmer. "I don't know how to thank you for warning me. If it wasn't for you, he'd have taken Peter and made ropes out of me. I would have given him anything to get my son back. At first, Ted seemed perfect to me. I thanked fate for our chance meeting. I was already a business owner when I met him. He was this handsome, modest guy who approached me at a club where my colleagues and I were celebrating another victory. He was charming, open, and young. He complimented me, gave me admiring glances. I knew he was younger, and our status was very different, but I couldn't help myself. I fell under his charm completely. It hadn't happened to me in a long time. Usually I look at things soberly and evaluate everything practically, but suddenly I was floating. Ted has a talent for offering what people want. He notices weaknesses and desires immediately. He uses that to achieve his goals. A born manipulator. Eva nodded. She couldn't help but agree with Hazel. Many things about her own relationship with Ted now took on new meaning after this overheard conversation. He had manipulated Eva to offer him money, and she had been glad he took it. Hazel, successful and mature, had lost her head over the charming young man. They had a passionate romance that led to her pregnancy. She was happy about it. She wasn't getting any younger. Her friends all had babies, and her personal life had been lacking. Being a successful woman, men were usually intimidated by her, but not Ted. He didn't care about such things. Hazel loved showering him with gifts. She enjoyed seeing him smile, liked making him happy. But the news of her pregnancy didn't delight Ted. Hazel understood why. He was young, hadn't lived enough for himself, wasn't planning for a family. Soon after, Ted disappeared, though not completely. He stayed in the city, frequenting bars and cafes, picking up new girls, but he cut all ties with Hazel. I'm ashamed to remember it now, but I was under his spell. I was hurt, devastated. I tried to get him back, caught him, humiliated myself, even stalked him at clubs and bars. What a fool I was. There I stood, with my big belly in the early morning, watching Ted leaving a club with some other girl. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones. I'm used to getting what I want, and it was such a blow. I didn't realize who Ted really was then. Just a common gold digger living off wealthy women, incapable of serious relationships or genuine feelings. When Peter was born, Hazel listed Ted as the father, hoping to make him take responsibility, something he actively avoided. 2 years passed, and Hazel found peace. She had almost forgotten about Ted, focusing entirely on her son, the charming little Peter. Life was good. She had a healthy child, prosperity, and a business that brought steady income. Then suddenly, Ted, the same man she used to chase, appeared out of the blue. Hazel was initially hopeful, though rekindling their relationship was out of the question. She welcomed the idea of Peter having contact with his father. She thought Ted had matured and recognized his mistakes. But it was something else entirely. Ted wanted money. He claimed she owed him for stealing his youth, for using him to have a baby. He spouted other nonsense too. It all came down to one thing. Ted knew she had money, and he demanded it. As he put it, he wanted compensation for my deception. Can you imagine? Hazel was first surprised, then indignant, then laughed in Ted's face. But he didn't back down. Instead, Ted began a real pursuit. He would wait for Hazel and Peter at stores, near the office, even right at their building entrance. He alternated between threats and pleas, begging Hazel to understand his position. Her mistake was giving him small sums of money at first, just to get him off their backs. It worked, but only briefly. Finally, Hazel packed up and moved with her son far away from Ted. Moving was a difficult decision. She had to make many changes. But Hazel didn't regret anything. Living in another city made her feel safe. Only he found us after a while anyway, and his demands multiplied. Hazel shook her head sadly. And now this. He's decided to steal Peter. That's crossing a line. What about the police? Suggested Eva. I'll be a witness. I heard everything. There's no proof, sighed Hazel. Besides, Ted is right. Peter is his son, and a father has the right to see his child. But it's not Peter that Ted wants, it's my money. I'd give him everything if I knew he'd leave me alone, but he won't. Not if I keep playing by the rules. Men like him need to be fought with their own tactics. Do you have a plan? Eva asked. She could tell by Hazel's expression that she was contemplating something serious. A plan B for emergencies. I didn't want to use it, but it seems we've reached that point. Eva walked along the embankment with Cooper. Yes, they were together again, holding hands and planning their wedding. It would be a beautiful celebration, a lavish feast, an engaging program, and many guests. Hazel and little Peter would be there too. The boy would even carry the cushion with the wedding rings. During his time apart from Eva, Cooper had thrown himself into developing his business. Now he owned a profitable auto repair shop that provided steady, substantial income. He had done it all for Eva, the woman he loved more than life itself. Cooper would move mountains for her, and he had achieved exactly what he'd set out to do. He no longer felt insecure about Eva being from a wealthy family. Now, Cooper had become successful himself, a young promising entrepreneur who could easily afford restaurant dinners and seaside vacations. A few months ago, Cooper arrived at Eva's office and waited for her, watching the entrance. When he saw her leave the building, he rushed to her with a bouquet of flowers. Cooper spoke sincere and heartfelt words about their misunderstanding, looking at her in such a way that made her head spin. I was a fool, I know. I made everything complicated and nearly ruined it all with my own hands, but now that's all in the past. The separation has proven to me that my feelings for you are something incredible and unique. It won't happen again. Will you forgive me? Instead of answering, Eva hugged him tightly, pressing herself against him. It was him, Cooper, beloved, real, familiar. Only when she was next to him did Eva realize how much she had missed him. He stroked her back and promised that everything would be all right now. Eva believed him and melted with happiness. She told Cooper about Ted and Hazel. Though Cooper knew Eva had met someone during their separation, he had no idea of the danger she had faced. "If only I had been there for you, this horrible story wouldn't have happened to you." "Yes, but who knows what would have happened to Hazel and Peter then?" Eva shook her head. Ted was far away now, and definitely would never set foot in this town again. Hazel had hired someone, though she didn't share specifics. She told Eva the general details of her plan. She would never have approached these people if not for the threat of losing her baby. Unable to risk Peter's safety, she had paid someone to have a serious talk with Ted. One early summer morning, Hazel and Peter came out of their building when Ted appeared from nowhere. He rushed at them, trying to snatch the child from her arms, convinced his plan was perfect. Ted didn't know they were being watched. He expected to take the child forcefully from a surprised Hazel and flee to a neighbouring town. He had already rented an apartment there with Eva's money, planning to wait for Hazel's ransom payment. He was certain the frightened mother would pay. But thanks to Eva's warning, Hazel was prepared. Two sturdy men who had been protecting the mother and child emerged from a nearby parked car. They grabbed Ted, subdued him, forced him into the car, and took him somewhere for a thorough discussion. After that, Ted left town. He packed his things and disappeared, never to be mentioned again. Hazel hinted to Eva that these men were professionals who knew how to be persuasive. "It's fortunate you overheard Ted's conversation and warned me," Hazel later told Eva. "If it hadn't been for you—" They were friends now, Hazel and Eva, discovering they had much in common. "Well, Ted does have good taste," Hazel joked, and Eva smiled, unable to disagree. It's true what people say. Sometimes misfortune leads to happiness. Through Ted, Eva had found both a friend and reclaimed her love. Strange as it seemed, she felt grateful to him for that.